79.
There, sir.
The matron pointed down the aisle of the sunny ward to the farthest bed on the right. Fairbanks tipped his hat and walked quickly. Although the walls were whitewashed and large arched windows admitted fresh air, he disliked the odors, the staleness of dressings, blood, strong cleaning solution. He stopped suddenly, and an orderly with a tray of medicine cups almost ran into him. Muttering an apology, Fairbanks thought he'd lost his mind. It was Carla in the last bed. A younger Carla, with less flesh on her face, but the same features, the same cap of bright gold hair. From a high window opposite the bed, sunlight fell on the boy and the gently moving shadow of a palm. The boy was supposed to be 12, but the size of his shoulders and the maturity of his face suggested 14 or 15. A bandage bulged on the back of his head, fastened with sticking plaster, the hair around it shaved. Fairbanks tapped his gold-headed stick on the bed's metal footrail. "Good morning. You're Jim David, aren't you?" The boy put down his dime novel and pulled the sheet higher over his coarse cotton gown. His eyes were large and as blue as Carla's. Fairbanks was unmanned by emotion. In a rush of excitement before leaving the city, he'd told Carla the boy's assumed name and mentioned Pasadena. To his astonishment, Carla broke down completely. Crying, she begged him to telephone the moment he found out whether or not it was their son. This touched him in a way he'd not been touched for a long time. He patted and soothed her and promised he'd call. The boy didn't directly answer the question. "Who are you?" "Allow me to introduce myself. Walter Fairbanks III. I'm an attorney." The identification was automatic. He was incomplete without it. "I came down from San Francisco to see you on a personal matter." He pointed his stick at a stool pushed under the bed. "Might I sit down?" Jim remained suspicious. "I guess." The stool was low, and Fairbanks felt awkward, less authoritative on it. His eye was on a level with the boy's hip. A patient in another bed called plaintively, Matron, may I have the, receptacle? Hurry, please, matron." Fairbanks concentrated on his son. "I'm familiar in a general way with the tabernacle in Pasadena, the fire set by the man who ran it. I'm sorry you were injured." Jim shrugged it away. "My head hurt like the devil for 3 days. It doesn't now. They'll take the stitching out Monday, they said. Then I can go home with Jocker." "Who's Jocker?" "A friend. He takes care of me like." Jim stared at the visitor, awaiting some better explanation than he'd received so far. The boy's deep blue eyes fascinated Fairbanks. They were a man's eyes, experienced, wary. How remarkable and strange that this was the offspring of his own loins. "The admitting records show your name as Jim David, but it isn't, is it? You're really James O. Chance." A curtain closed behind the boy's eyes. "Who are you? What is this about?" "Please, Fairbanks extended a gray-gloved hand, a supplicant. Tiny sapphires of sweat popped out in his trimmed mustache. "It's very hard for me to answer that. You see," he faltered again, he had no skill in personal dealings, no charm like that bastard Chance had. He felt especially inadequate dealing with a son. All at once, Jim's face showed hostility. "Then just answer." "I am—" Fairbanks cleared his throat like a public speaker. "I'm your real father." There was a long, long silence. "Oh, matron, I'm finished with the, receptacle." Jim rolled up the dime novel and held it in both hands, his knuckles white. "What are you saying to me?" "I know it's probably difficult for you to comprehend that assertion." Angry tears appeared. "Use words I can understand, will you?" I'm sorry," Fairbanks blurted, his voice pitching high. He made nervous gestures, like quirky attempts at a smile. "I'm a lawyer, you see, accustomed to a certain formal— Christ, I'm botching it. Yes, well, what I said is true. I'll take all the time necessary to explain the circumstances, but I'm telling you the truth. Please believe me. Your mother is Carla Hellman. When you were born, she was married to James Macklin Chance of San Francisco and Riverside. But Chance is not really... that is... Jim's incredulous expression undermined him, and he faltered again, his voice weakening. Please give me the opportunity to prove what I'm saying. Can you get out of bed? Walk down to the superintendent's office with me. I'll telephone your mother. You can speak to her, and she'll corroborate everything. That sentence died, too. It was no good. The boy stared at him with open disbelief and even fright. Fairbanks reached out to touch him. Jim, you're my son. Jim pulled away from the pleading hand. I don't understand this, but I don't think I want to, mister. Fairbanks heard something new in the boy's voice, a deep underground river of emotion rushing to the surface. My father is the man who brought me up, J.M. Chance. He was rotten to me sometimes, but he's my father. I can't change that, and you can't either. Fairbanks jumped up so fast the stool fell over. A man with his foot in traction called, I'm trying to rest here. You ran away from him, Jim. What's that to you? Maybe there were reasons. But you've never gone back to him. Fairbanks grabbed his wrist. You're my son. Macklin Chance has beaten me every other way. He isn't going to beat me with my own flesh and... Let go. Get away. Fairbanks held on, control crumbling. The boy twisted his strong, tanned wrist, but Fairbanks held on. Damn it, let go, mister. You're crazy. The lawyer's gray metal eyes had a strange, frantic light in them. Oh, Jim, I beg you. Matron! Jim shouted over Fairbanks's shoulder. Matron! My own son's frightened of me. Look at him, terrified. Chance did this. Fairbanks let go of Jim's wrist and stepped back all the way to the aisle. His hand flew to his cravat. It didn't need straightening, but he straightened it. A swift look revealed the matron bearing down, skirts flying, a bull-necked orderly close behind. Sir, you are not permitted to come in here and disrupt... Excuse me, Walter Fairbanks said. He shoved the matron, then rushed by her, avoiding the orderly's grasping hand, and ran out of the ward. He ran down the noisy wooden stairs, the heat of humiliation fevering his face. He ran past puzzled employees peering from doorways and a cashier's wicket. He ran out of the hospital, beaten. 80. 3 nights later, at dark, Fairbanks walked into Three Dog Alley in the squalid Chinese section on Upper Broadway. Fairbanks was usually a controlled man, but for 3 days and nights he'd been out of control, drinking recklessly, yet staying sober enough to, first, conceive the idea, and second, make his inquiries. He'd cashed a large draft at a correspondent bank of Fairbanks Trust, and with that money he'd loosened tongues. Yes, one saloon keeper said, that man had been seen around town. Another informant said the man had a liking for the poppy. A third sent him to a tea parlor controlled by the Hong Chow Company, the largest criminal tong in Los Angeles. An enormous, oily Chinese with a dropsicle eyelid and a diamond-studded ring in his left ear grinned and wiggled his fingers for more money. $50 wasn't enough. He pocketed another $50, shrugged, and said Fairbanks might try Mr. Tom Sun Lux in Three Dog Alley. No guarantees. Sometime during this rolling binge, Fairbanks remembered his wife's plea and telephoned San Francisco. He didn't reveal any details of his defeat at the hospital, but simply told Carla the boy had a new life in Southern California and didn't want to return to his old one. Oh, tell me, how did he look? She asked. Fine, he said, and hung up. He leaned his head against the wall by the telephone. God damn you, Chance. So he'd not told his wife everything, not said a word about his drunken binge, a necessary purging of his pain, and a purifying and focusing of his intent. He certainly would never utter a word about this expedition into a filthy little corner of hell called Three Dog Alley. Though it was warm in Los Angeles, he'd put on his overcoat to hide his fine clothes. You didn't advertise your station or prosperity in this kind of criminous sewer. Strange foreign eyes blinked at him from windows in dim hovels. By the light of pretty paper lanterns on a porch, a girl of 12 or 13 opened her blouse and showed him breasts like small pears. An old woman with an idiot grin and no teeth fondled his arm.
You like a boy, gentlemen?
Fairbanks walked on. A short-haired dog with scaly flanks squatted in front of him, shitting. Fairbanks kicked at the dog, and it snapped back at him. He walked perhaps a block, but it seemed like miles. Finally, following the directions on a crumpled scrap, he located the establishment of Mr. Tom Sun Luck by means of Arabic numerals painted under Chinese characters on the doorpost. Mr. Tom Sun Luck was a curious hybrid, white skin, oriental features. Quite old, he was unctuously accommodating. In his round cap and threadbare silk gown, he conducted Fairbanks to his cellar, a dirt-floored corridor with curtained doorways on both sides. Heavy white smoke with a fruity odor drifted the length of it. Mr. Tom Sun Luck led him to a beaded curtain at the end, which he rattled by brushing it with his 4-inch fingernails.
Right there. You pay me now.
Fairbanks jammed $10 into the queer creature's hand, and the ringers shut like a spring trap. Leave me alone with him.
Sure, okay, Mr. Big Shot.
Tom Sun Luck shuffled away into the dark. Fairbanks parted the curtain and stepped through. A wick shimmered in a small, shallow bowl of oil standing on a crate. It was the only illumination in the dirt-walled cubicle. Eyes closed, Wyatt lay on his side in a wood bunk covered with sheets of a Chinese newspaper. He wore a filthy dark sweater and pants. His right hand dangled over the edge of the bunk, near a crate littered with paraphernalia, a small clamshell that held a long steel needle and a small brown ball of opium, a spirit lamp, extinguished at the moment, a pipe with an ivory-banded bamboo stem, ivory mouthpiece, and large 4-sided happiness bowl. He approached the foul bunk, his soles crunching on something that might have been dried rodent droppings. Wyatt's eyes opened. "Hello, Brother Paul. Do you remember me?" Wyatt's white spiked hair had a dull, greasy shine, and his once handsome face was dirty and wasted. Blinking, he lifted his head a few inches.
I remember.
Grunting, he worked his left elbow under his side and raised himself a little higher.
No more donations. I'm not Brother Paul now.
What a pathetic joke. What a pathetic man. I know. It took me a long time to find you in this hole. I imagine you're extremely short on money. Wyatt's enlarged eyes showed a sleepy interest. I have money. Money comes in, but it isn't enough anymore. Never enough. I'm prepared to pay you a very considerable sum in return for— Fairbanks licked his lips. A service. That's nice. How much? Enough to buy a lot of these. Fairbanks indicated the pipe. For a long time to come. That's nice, Wyatt murmured again. What do you want? I want someone— As he'd done in the hospital, he faltered. The magnitude of the step brought to mind the platitudinous pronouncements of his law school professors. It gave him pause, until he remembered all the wrongs done to him. I want someone taken out. Is that the phrase? Removed. Is that clearer? Wyatt swung his legs off the bunk and sat up. He pushed his fingers through his white-winged hair, smoothing it back from his temples. Sickle moons of dirt showed under his fingernails. Now that Fairbanks had adjusted to the cellar's pervasive opium smell, he could pick up another, more offensive one. Wyatt's clothing was foul as a privy. You mean killed? Fairbanks swallowed. Yes. Lovely. Why not? Quickly, Fairbanks parted the rattling bead curtain. The dark cellar was still empty. He went back to the bunk. If you do the service, my name must never be connected with it. Never. It's possible, Wyatt said. Anything's possible for a price. He smiled at his caller. Who is it? If he answered, he couldn't go back. Well, what of it? The deed first contemplated in anger could be done handily, because this piece of human refuse was desperate, and there would be no witnesses to a bargain. The morality of it didn't trouble Fairbanks, only personal safety after the fact. I said, who is it? I'll tell you. When you hear, I believe you'll be eager to help me. 10. California Gold, 1911. In 1905, in Chicago, a new and different kind of labor union arose. The old AF of L was an alliance of craft workers, men who clung to their pride and skills and wanted no part of common, untrained laborers. But Eugene Debs, Big Bill Haywood, and other socialists decided that exclusionary pride was dangerous and wrong. Trade unionism and the new century demanded something better: the international workers of the world. The new union planned to organize the skilled and unskilled alike, industry by industry, not craft by craft. The IWW pushed first into the lumbering regions of the Pacific Northwest. Soon, shocked citizens and outraged owners were hearing a new rhetoric, one that called for the pie in the sky of a workers' paradise, brought about, if need be, through sabotage and the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. Reaction was predictable. General Otis called IWW men criminal syndicalist scum and sneered at them as wobblies. The name caught on. As the first decade of the century ended, the wobblies eyed the golden fields of California, the valley towns where rich crops were harvested and large migrant populations could be recruited for the Union. From Missoula, Spokane, Denver, and elsewhere, wobblies began riding the rods into the valley. They jumped off at places like Bakersfield, Brawley, Stockton, and Visalia. Always their technique was the same: agitate, heighten class awareness, promote worker solidarity through mass meetings and street corner oratory. Rarely did they talk specifically of union organization. Instead, they rallied against local bourgeois agents who manipulated and cheated field workers through their slave labor marts. Of course, the unspoken antidote was organization, but in the wobbly master plan, that came later. To make sure they wouldn't be run out of a town too soon, the wobblies raised a second cry: free speech. It was a shrewd strategy, because free speech was exactly what the wobbly-hating authorities had to suppress in order to suppress the Union. The harder that police and civil authorities pushed on this issue, however, the harder the wobblies fought back. Every time they were seriously threatened, they sent pleas to Union members around the nation. In the fall of 1910, wobblies were riding west in response to the latest war cry in their newspaper: "Free speech fight is on." And so it was. The wobblies were campaigning in Fresno. For a couple of months, the police there merely harassed them sporadically. But then, in December, the town stepped up the fight. The Fresno Board of Trustees unanimously passed an ordinance that said, in part, "It shall be and is hereby made unlawful for any person to hold, conduct, or address any assemblage, meeting, or gathering of persons, or to make or deliver any public speech, lecture, discourse, or to conduct or take part in any public debate, in or upon any public park, public street, or alley within the 48-block area bounded by Tuolumne, M, Inyo, and D streets." This was, of course, an abrogation of the First Amendment to the Constitution. The wobblies advertised again: "Free speech fight needs your help. Rally around. All aboard for Fresno." 81. Winter rains. All day and all night, they poured over the red tiles of Villa Mediterranean. Mac heard them in his dreams. The days of January marched by in gray procession. He tired of working an hour after he began, and his hands hurt constantly. He spread them on his desk. The knuckles were enlarged, the hands of an old man. In every mirror that old man mocked him. White hair, lackluster eyes behind the round schoolmaster glasses. Something had died. Maybe just the energy to pursue dreams. T. Fowler Haynes remained on his corner of the desk. One afternoon, Mac idly opened to the foreword. "I have never beheld a place where I would so gladly fix my permanent abode as in this paradise of sunshine." Liar. Mac sighed and shut the guidebook. The rains of January 1911 poured down. He was 42 years old. The detective Bill Burns called at Riverside. "The mayor of the city of Los Angeles hired me for the Times case. We're going to unravel it and hang those dynamiters. I'll tell you where I'm looking, Mac. Indianapolis, Indiana. It's the home office of the Bridge and Structural Iron Workers Union. I know you feel strongly for union men. Well, not union men who do murder, I'd not accuse you of that. But you're partial to the movement as a whole. You can't deny it. That's why I want to be square with you. Square and in the open. We're on opposite sides this time, boyo." They shook hands, and Mac wished Bill Burns well. On a blowy day of large clouds and cool sunshine, there came to the pretty little town of San Solaro one Jakob Steinweiss of the Kalem Studios, for the founders Klein, Long, and Marion, of 21st Street, New York. He found Mac examining some construction blueprints in the cool shade of the bandstand in San Solaro Park. Steinweiss introduced himself with a business card instead of verbally. He was, at best, 25 years old, a studious but starved-looking fellow with a lot of white teeth and a smile of radiant innocence. Mac presumed you didn't get by in the picture business, as you didn't get by in any other, on innocence. Steinweiss had to have something more. One readily apparent trait was enthusiasm. He shook his head when Mac offered him a seat on a bandstand bench, bobbing up and down on his brown calfskin shoes. Though he probably couldn't afford it, Steinweiss dressed himself like an Englishman, in a walking suit of tan worsted, a figured brown four in hand, tan derby, gloves, and spats. Somehow his energy amused Mac, while saddening him a little, too. He remembered when he'd felt the same way about opportunities. "Sir," Steinweiss began, "I'm quite experienced in moving pictures. 3 years at Sid Olcott's right hand. I worked on many westerns shot on the Jersey Palisades. I was Sid's assistant director on the one reel—" He stopped, unable to continue. No sound came from his mouth. "Mr. Steinweiss, what's wrong?" The young man reddened, seeming to tense and tremble all over. He made queer gargling sounds. At last he burst out, "Nothing." The color rushed from his face. "I have a certain slight problem with—" Another long, choked silence. "Stammering. The picture to which I referred is—" Finally the name exploded. "Ben-Hur." "I saw that," Mac told him. "It was good." Steinweiss slumped, too overcome with embarrassment to care about the compliment. Mac liked him for admitting his problem. He asked him again to be seated, and this time Steinweiss sank gratefully onto a bench. "It isn't easy being a moving picture man and another painful pause. "A Jew, and a stammerer, too. 3 strikes, as the ball players say. On the other hand, the more obstacles a man confronts, the more he's challenged to stretch himself and achieve, wouldn't you say?" "Yes, definitely. But what brings you here?" "I came to California originally because I saw more opportunity, but I refused to work for others the rest of my life. I am looking for property, land on which to start the Emery Stone Studio, a more euphonious name than Steinweiss, don't you think?" He was relaxed now, and having less trouble with his speech. I have the promise of a loan if I locate suitable land. I found 100 acres in the foothills of Hollywood. Ideal. Please sell them to me, Mr. Chance. What property is it exactly? Here, I'll show you. I brought along a surveyor's drawing. Steinweiss unfolded it, and Mac put on his spectacles. I have studied you, Mr. Chance. For weeks now I have been doing it. You have huge holdings. You'll never miss this 100 acres. Please, set any fair price and I'll pay it. Just sell me the land for my studio. Give me my dream in, after the strained silence, California. Mac ended the meeting without committing himself. I'll think about it and let you know, he said. Steinweiss smiled, shook his hand, and uttered a perfectly articulated thank you. But he looked heartbroken. A week later, two gentlemen from the town of Hollywood arranged an appointment through Alex and visited Mac in San Solaro. They represented something called the Committee of Conscientious Citizens. They were pale, forgettable sorts. Mr. Silas Ribner didn't mention his occupation. Mr. Joe Hughes sold real estate. We're Christians and Protestants, Mr. Chance, said Hughes. We understand you are too. Hollywood is a Christian community, up and coming, full of boosters. We don't like this movie crowd from the East. We don't like them renting rooms, and we especially don't want them settling permanently. That's why we organized. Our committee got wind of this little New York Jew who wants to buy a piece of your land. We ask you to help us keep Hollywood a safe, clean, residential community of Christian people. Don't sell to him. You came all the way out here to speak against a man because he's a Jew? Mr. Ribner's ire was aroused. A motion picture Jew, doubly undesirable. You can see that, surely. I can see that you're a pair of bigots. Mr. Chance, cried Hughes, jumping up. Out of this house before I throw you down the stairs myself. They left in a huff. 2 nights later, at 11:30, Mac received a telephone call from Alex down in Riverside. I was just contacted by the authorities in Hollywood. You know the old abandoned barn on the property Steinweiss wants to buy? Someone torched it this afternoon. The next night, after supper, Mac took another call. Jew lover, said a distant, unfamiliar voice, and hung up. God, I don't need this, Mac said. In other days, in better times, he would have leaped into a fight with Hughes, Ribner, and the Hollywood burghers they represented. He loathed such men. They reminded him of Fairbanks and of all the others who wanted to slam doors when he first trudged down from the mountains in '87. Now, though, things were different. His mood had been darkened by recent events, and the winter, and a persistent sense of failure. He'd lost Jim. He'd lost Nellie long ago. He seemed to have lost his grip on life itself. Were it not for the stewardship of good, trustworthy helpers like Alex Muller, Enrique Potter, and Rhett Haverstick, God knew that he might have lost his millions, too. Steinweiss telephoned at least once a day, pressing for a decision. As Mac stared at the little message chits, his antagonism focused on Steinweiss rather than the self-professed Hollywood Christians. Get out of California, Steinweiss. Go home. I don't need your money. I don't need your trouble. The short letter that went to Steinweiss in early February said in part, I have considered your offer. I can't at this time see my way clear. One gray afternoon in the February of what seemed an endless winter, Mac quit work at 2:30 and went for a drive alone. The Packard bumped down the foothill drive, which the rains had rutted badly. At the bottom, turning into the main road to Riverside, he heard a loud report. Backfire, he thought, but he'd felt the left side of the auto vibrate. He parked and got out to study the Packard's yellow paint. What he saw made the hair on the back of his neck crawl. Round and black, a hole was punched through the passenger door. Scanning the groves across the road, he saw some men at work, but they were too far away to be clearly visible. He also heard a horseman somewhere, but couldn't see him. He stuck his finger in the hole, all the way through to the inside of the auto. Then he spied something gray and flat on the floor rug. The spent bullet. He thought of the committee of conscientious citizens from Hollywood. My God, surely not. But what other explanation is there? He said to Hellburner Johnson at supper that evening. Johnson had stepped off the 5 p.m. local. He had a week's vacation from SNA while Anderson rushed to Chicago to confer with Spoor about broadening distribution of the stupendously successful Bronco Billy pictures. In the next, Johnson was to be promoted to town marshal, a major character part. "Dunno, Mac," Johnson said. "You've made a passel of enemies in your time. Could be any one of 'em. Does it make a hell of a lot of difference who's on the giving end, so long as you don't get caught receiving?" Mac retrieved his .45 shopkeeper's Colt from its peg in the office closet. He oiled it and wore it wherever he went now, with spare ammunition weighing down a coat pocket. Sometimes the chopped-off peacemaker reassured him. Other times he was more realistic. Lot of good a holstered revolver would do if some crazy Californian wanted to blow him down from ambush. Carla saw him quite suddenly, his face bright as a coin, lit by winter sunshine. He was up on a ladder spraying some chemical on a Valencia orange tree. "Pull over, park here," she said, tapping the chauffeur. He steered the touring sedan to the shoulder. "Not so far," she exclaimed as the bonnet nosed up beside a tall billboard that trumpeted Redlands Citrus Cooperative. The chauffeur braked, the rear end of the auto stopping clear of the board. Carla had badgered her husband until he'd revealed where he had seen the boy. He would say no more than Pasadena, so she resorted to using her own money to hire a private inquiry bureau. "Don't bother me with a lot of details. Just come back to me when you know where he is." It took them 7 weeks, starting at the Pasadena Police Department. Her son had been a witness to some crime, and though the perpetrator had disappeared, the boy had been required to leave a forwarding address in case the man was caught and indicted. The address was no longer good when the detectives got there, but the landlord said he'd put Jim and his companion or guardian in touch with a relative, a grower in Redlands, who always needed good workers. Her son was working in the groves and living with the older man in a shanty in the country outside Redlands. He was apparently making no effort to conceal his whereabouts. Well, why should he? Weak yellow sunshine bathed the car and reflected from its windows. The chauffeur lit a cigarette. Carla cranked her window down a few inches. Several of the workers had noticed the long, dark car and were staring, but Jim had given it a glance and gone back to work. Even so, Carla drew back into the shadow of the tonneau, as if anyone could see her, heavily veiled as she was. The veil was golden silk, thin as a membrane of some shining insect. It hid the unbidden tears on her cheeks. What a handsome boy he was, darkened by weather, slim, and strong-looking in his denim pants and old shirt. Flesh of her flesh. The sight of him made her feel soft and full of a diffuse love. She wanted to know that he was all right. She wanted to know that he could care for himself. He certainly looked capable of it. Tall, hardy, and capable. A young man. "Mrs. Fairbanks?" said the chauffeur, finishing his cigarette. "Not yet. In a moment."
"Water,"
Jocker said as he pulled the handcart through the grove.
"Water here, my lads."
When the orchard workers surrounded his cart, he handed out dippers filled from 2 casks. The owner of this orchard was a decent man, took care of his help. That's why Jim insisted they stay on. The winter afternoon had a muted pastel quality. Spears of misty sunshine thrust between the trees and the earth, and the air smelled sweet and damp. A speeding train whistled in the distance, but the real world seemed remote. Jocker picked up the cart handles and trudged along to the end of the row. Jim was just coming down the ladder with his sprayer.
"Hello, Jocker,"
Jim said.
"Hand me some water, will you? It's stinking work spraying this stuff."
Jocker couldn't work on the trees because of his arthritis, but he could do odd jobs like pulling the water cart. Together, he and Jim made enough to live decently, and drifted through the days with no ambition but to get their food and sleep and an occasional growler of beer. That was fine with Jim after the ordeal with Brother Paul at the tabernacle. Jocker passed out dippers to 3 other men, then filled one for Jim. Jocker wore a regular jeans coat and pants now. No more peculiar tramp costumes. A Redlands barber cut his hair once a month for 10 cents. Jim insisted. As he handed the boy the dipper, he spied an auto partly hidden by the co-op's billboard at the edge of the grove. "Did you see that car?" Jocker said. Jim nodded. "Someone inside is lamping us pretty hard." Jim turned and saw a woman in a huge hat and golden veil. She saw him look and drew back from the window. "Just some tourist," he said with a shrug. The auto started its engine and pulled away in a cloud of exhaust. Carla clasped her hands tightly in her lap. She was thankful for the veil. The chauffeur wouldn't see her tears. She struggled to keep them silent. What a handsome lad, her son. He favored her, resembled her unmistakably. She hoped he didn't resemble her emotionally or psychologically. That would ruin him. For a moment back there, she'd wanted to step out, run to him, and clasp him to her. "Hello, Jim. I'm your mother." Ridiculous. She knew what she was. Why spoil his life? The auto bumped on down the country road towards Redlands. In the last week of February, Margaret motored from the city to the Monterey Peninsula, a 5-shot pistol under her seat in case of trouble. No one molested her, though she had to change a tire and laid her stop overnight. In Carmel, she asked directions to Nellie's cottage by the sea. She found Nellie in disarray, the sleeves of her shirtwaist blouse rolled up, the tie collar undone, the bosom smudged all over with lead pencil. Margaret was beautifully and expensively dressed. She gave Nellie her hand and a mauve glove. "I do hope you'll forgive the unannounced call. You've no telephone here, so I couldn't contact you in advance." For a moment, opening the door, Nellie had looked annoyed, but it had passed now, and she was gracious. "Come in, please, Miss Leslie. I know your face. I saw your last picture, Bronco Billy and the Orphan. You were very good." "Thank you. That's very kind of you. The films are enormously popular. America loves Billy." The cottage smelled of fresh coffee. Nellie showed Margaret a sunlit writing table and many discarded sheets of foolscap. "I've been drafting an article for William R. Hearst. I don't do many of them anymore, but he'll take any that I finish. His editors send me pleading letters regularly. They'd like me to cover news stories again. I do that once in a great while." "You certainly don't need to. You're a very famous and successful writer. I admired Huntworthy's Millions more than I can say." "Thank you." Nellie cleared some pillows from a sofa. "Would you care to sit down?" The initial pleasantries were running to their end, and Nellie's dark eyes fixed on her visitor curiously. "Might we walk down to the beach?" Margaret said then. "I hear it's lovely. I've never been fortunate enough to visit in Carmel before." "Then this is a special occasion." Nellie reached for a shawl. "But I'm really not sure why you're paying this call, Miss Leslie." "To speak to you about a man who matters to both of us, Mac Chance." They crossed the dune to the same shore Mac and Nellie had walked before. This afternoon the vista was considerably more beautiful. Long white combers rolled in, and the ocean, dark as navy cloth, sparkled in the sunshine. The cloudless air made for superb visibility. The horizon seemed to be 100 miles away. After they talked a while, Nellie sat down on a driftwood log. She planted her chin in the palm of her hands and stared out to sea, the salty wind tossing her straight dark hair. Today she was the hoyden, while Margaret, swan-necked Margaret with her smart clothes and aristocratic features, might have come from a society luncheon at the St. Francis. Margaret had a courtly air. It befitted a member of America's new, slightly scandalous, but vastly admired moving picture royalty. "It's all very well to say these things, Miss Leslie, how I ought to think differently about Mac because he's changed. But he has, in certain important ways. Let me repeat what I said as we walked down here. Mac encouraged me in my career with S&A. He never once discouraged me because I was female." Nellie made a cynical little moo. "Apparently he has different rules for different people." "Well, I'm sure there are special ones for you. You're the only one he truly cares for other than his son who's gone. Why are you doing this, crusading for him?" "Because I love him." "You love him, probably as much as you do." "See here, I'm not absolutely sure that I—" She stopped, an elbow on her knee, the back of her wrist to her forehead. "Hell, that's a lie. Of course I do." Margaret smiled, then said in a gentle and sympathetic way, "You've also cleared up one terrible, ridiculous misunderstanding. Mac never asked me about my visitor from Northern California. I never even saw him that night. He just went off with his assumptions and skulked. He's an impulsive man. He can be frightfully wrong-headed. Does that mean you should reject him forever? If you do, you're not the intelligent woman whose mind shines through in her books." "You're certainly forthright." Nellie pressed her lips together. "Sorry, I am too. When forthrightness is applied to oneself, it can sting badly." "To be sure," Margaret agreed. She found Nellie both too defensive and too uncertain, and she decided a jolt was needed. "I'll be leaving soon. Please understand one more thing before I go. I'm no altruist. I'd take Mac Chance away from you in a trice if I had the slightest hope of doing so. I don't. He doesn't return my affection. I've accepted that. I have my own life, and I intend to get on. Mac feels strongly about you. Two people who care for each other shouldn't be kept apart by trivialities." "That sounds perfectly reasonable, but I'll tell you it isn't easy for me to admit past mistakes." "He said the same thing." "There you are." Nellie made a helpless little gesture. "Impasse." "If you choose." "If I choose?" "Yes, I think so. It's 1911, Miss Ross. A lot of time has passed since you and Mac first met. He's a wonderful, brave man in spite of his shortcomings, which I don't minimize for one moment. However, no man like Mac will spend the rest of his life alone. Eventually, he'll find another woman. More likely, she'll find him. She'll be enthusiastic about his virtues, quite willing to forgive his worst faults, and he'll respond. One of these days, when he's tired of being alone, he'll respond to that woman, and if she's someone other than you, it would be a tragedy." "What can I do?" Nellie exclaimed. "I'm what I am. I grew up poor, Miss Ross, but we had a neighbor, a farmer, who was prosperous. He planted many willow trees on his property. I loved them. I noticed that even if there was a fierce storm, they survived. They bent, but didn't break. And after the storm, they kept their same beauty, their same shape, their same character." Nellie stared at her. Margaret smiled again. She held out her mauve glove, and Nellie grasped it, looking a bit dazed. "Thank you for your courtesy, Miss Ross. I hope I've not offended you with my candor." "No," Nellie said, though there was a strange, distracted light in her eyes. She gazed at the ocean, the combers, the wheeling gulls. "No," she said again, sounding unsure. Margaret went over the dune and left her. Nellie sat a long time, her head in her hands. It was a defeated posture, not characteristic of her, but the visitor had shattered her defenses with her unexpected candor. "She's right," Nellie thought. "I've done so many things wrong. My ambition was proper, his wasn't. I have a lot to make up for." To Mac in Riverside, Margaret wrote, "Her lover is her favorite cousin, Tomas, the one she accompanied to Yosemite Valley when she was small. She said she told you about him years ago. You're an idiot, Chance. I forgive you because idiocy is inevitable. You're a man. Love, M." 82. They ate their lunch at an Armenian restaurant. The proprietor was friendly to the movement, so no one caused them trouble. There was little conversation. The Fresno campaign had begun with enthusiasm in August, but since then enthusiasm had waned. The campaign had gotten rough, and the number of men willing to risk themselves was shrinking. Today they were down to 3. Now they left the restaurant silently, Marquez carrying the soapbox, Frank Little, the tough, bantam-sized leader of Local 66, the flag. Gopal Mukherjee trailed along with copies of The Industrial Worker for distribution to listeners, if they managed to collect any listeners on this weekday in late February. Mukherjee was a slight, sinewy brown man, 22 years old. His eyes were small and bright, his face dark and finely featured. He came from a village near Julandur in the Punjab, and had crossed the Canadian border and worked his way down to California when he was 19. He read English passably and had a large fund of off-color stories that he was fond of relating in Hindi to other workers from his part of the world. They set up on the usual corner, Mariposa and I Streets. Marquez placed the soapbox. He lived up to the name Wobbly. A fever was consuming him. After 3 days in solitary and a night of the water cure in the Fresno jail, he'd taken sick. It was the 3rd time he'd been locked up since the campaign started. Frank Little unfurled the red flag, then slipped the staff into a hole in a corner of the box. His good eye raked the streets. The other eye was milky and useless. As he seated the staff, the side of his coat lifted to reveal the walnut butt of a revolver stuffed in his pants. Many of the Wobblies practiced what they called passive resistance. Frank Little thought it not only cowardly but stupid. Gopal Mukherjee placed himself next to the box, an engaging smile on his face. He wore second-hand pants, a much-washed blue cotton shirt, and a spotless white turban, his treasure. A well-dressed gentleman in a bowler paused to spit a cigar cutting at his feet, and Mukherjee smiled and offered a copy of his paper. The gentleman hit it with his walking stick and strode away, muttering about anarchy. Mukherjee kept on smiling. A trolley passed, bell ringing. I and Mariposa was a busy downtown intersection in the city of 25,000. There were buildings of Victorian gingerbread on the corners, trolley tracks, trolley wires, and modern autos along with farm wagons, pedestrians, and horsemen. The Wobblies were by now a familiar sight in town. What little attention they generated was mostly silent, mostly hostile. Marquez put a foot on the soapbox. The toe of his shoe was split, showing a dirty sock. His stained and wrinkled black suit resembled a priest's, but his shirt was red silk. Mukherjee found Marquez's seediness quite distasteful. Like most Hindustanis, he bathed every day if it was possible. He considered personal hygiene almost as important as one's religion. "Sure you're up to this, Diego?" Frank Little asked. His good eye shifted here and there, searching out potential danger. "Certainly. If not me, who else?" Marquez said. Above his long beard, his cheeks glistened as if they were greased. Sometimes Marquez felt a vast futility about this campaign. A lot of comrades had come to Fresno in the fall, riding the rods from Denver, Salt Lake, Chicago. But a lot of them were gone now, scared out by the billy clubs of Chief Shaw's police, the midnight torchings of wobbly tents out in the western city limits, the screaming editorials in the Morning Republican and the Sacramento Bee, the vagrancy arrests, the militant patriotic wrath of sentencing judges, the brutal jail with its bread-and-water diet and its water cure. A lot of the comrades had worked off their sentences with leaf rakes in Courthouse Park, then fled. Others had pleaded guilty and been paroled on condition that they leave town. Still, Marquez refused to quit. On the 20th of December last, the Fresno trustees had unanimously passed the anti-speaking ordinance. Marquez was determined to test it until they smashed it, or the campaign smashed him. Which, given his bleary head and burning skin, it might. He stepped up on the box. The intersection tilted 45 degrees and swam out of focus, and his gut fluttered. Then the intersection slowly tilted back to horizontal and 45 degrees the other way. Finally, it settled to normal. A light breeze fluttered the red banner. "Ladies and gentlemen, I address you once more on the subject of free speech, which is guaranteed to us by the United States Constitution." The ex-priest's audience consisted of his two comrades and a painted wooden Indian chief outside a tobacco shop. Gopal Mukherjee, smiling and earnest, offered his papers to the empty air. Marquez swung into his standard oration. "The war we are waging is being fought all across California. International Workers of the World campaigns for freedom of speech in San Francisco, Bakersfield, Brawley, and many other places." He eulogized the First Amendment and damned the Fresno authorities for abridging it. It was part of the IWW strategy not to speak directly to labor issues in these soapbox addresses, but to stand instead as defenders of fundamental rights, of keeping the streets open for free expression, which of course included keeping the parks and plazas open for rallies to organize the railroad and field workers of the valley towns. Both the IWW and its enemies understood the scenario, though most street corner listeners did not. Marquez spoke passionately for 5 minutes, flailing away at the air with flamboyant gestures. He collected an audience of 3, a coarse-faced farm woman with her adolescent son, and a dandy in a checked vest who cleaned his teeth with a gold pick while he listened. Marquez then heard the siren. Distant, but coming fast. Gopal Mukherjee's brown eyes darted to Frank Little, who fanned back his coat and unbuttoned his vest, leaving the pistol butt in the clear. The eyes of the young Hindustani grew round, and his smile wavered. He'd been in Fresno, taking part in the campaign only for a week. He'd not been rousted from the streets before. The gent with the gold toothpick darted into a dry goods store. The farm lady said, "We're late, Rupert," and hurried the gawky lad away just as the police sedan careened into sight behind a hay wagon on I Street. Marquez rubbed his eyes with the tips of his fingers, trying to clear his vision. "Remember, Gopal, fall down limp if they seize you." "I remember, Diego," Mukherjee said with a fervent nod. He spoke English with the clipped upper-class accents of his white schoolmasters in the Jalandhar district. "You won't catch me falling down," Little said. "I ain't going back in the tank one more time." Marquez shrugged. "As you wish." He stayed on the box by the fluttering banner. A black police sedan, its canvas top down, screamed into the curb. A small crowd gathered across the street. 5 Fresno policemen in brass buttons and blue serge piled out like cops in a one-reel chase comedy. Marquez's heartbeat sped. There was nothing funny about these men with their tall hats, soup-strainer mustaches, and billy clubs. He'd met all but one of them before. "Get down from there, Marquez," said the sergeant, brandishing his billy. "You're in violation of the anti-speaking ordinance, same as you were last Tuesday, and the week before, and the week previous to that." Marquez stayed on the box. "Sergeant Loomis, I am exercising my right of free speech. I refuse to be moved." Loomis was a big, hearty man with a good-natured face, everyone's uncle. He sighed. "You're under arrest." Gopal Mukherjee spoke up politely and seriously. "Sergeant, if I may point out something." "Oh, we got a new wobbly here," another policeman said. "A raghead." "For Christ's sake, Gopal," Frank Little whispered. Mukherjee wouldn't be deterred. "Sirs, the Constitution of this great republic guarantees to all men the right of expression without interference." "Is that a fact, sir?" Sergeant Loomis said, edging up to him. "I didn't realize I was in the presence of such a distinguished and informed person as yourself. A regular street lawyer, is that what we have here?" "No, sir," Mukherjee said, misunderstanding the sarcasm as sincerity. "I am Mr. Gopal Mukherjee, a field worker. It is kind of you to allow me to state my view." "Jesus," Frank Little groaned, slipping back into shadows by the storefronts. Loomis grinned. "Why, sure, raghead. Just any time." His arm flew up and his billy smashed across Mukherjee's nose. The Indian screamed as blood spurted out. Sergeant Loomis was quick for a man of his age and bulk, sidestepping so Mukherjee's blood spattered Marquez's trousers. A cop swung his billy into Marquez's spine, and he was pitched off the soapbox. 2 policemen caught Marquez and began to pound him with their clubs, while 2 others seized Mukherjee and worked on him. The corner of eye and Mariposa resounded with the whap and crunch of billies. A gentleman in the small crowd of spectators applauded. "Don't fight them," Marquez shouted, hanging limp in the hands of a cop. He shielded his head with his arms, but otherwise offered no resistance. Blue legs and backs hid him from Mukherjee, who was himself surrounded. Loomis kicked Mukherjee's ribs repeatedly. In the shade by the storefront, Frank Little drew his revolver partway, then gave up and fled down the street. Mukherjee's cries and the pulpy sound of billies followed him as he ran. The booking officer asked their names. Mukherjee had been coached. He smiled politely. "John Doe, sir." Asked his name, Marquez said, "Harrison Gray Otis." "I'll kill one of these fuckers someday," Sergeant Loomis muttered behind them. The police threw them in a cell with 3 other wobblies, previously identified on the blotters as Woodrow Wilson, Leland Stanford, and John L. Sullivan. Because Marquez was obviously ill, the wobblies made room for him on the only bunk. Mukherjee sat down in the corner with a forlorn air. Messrs. Wilson, Stanford, and Sullivan were in good fettle considering their ragged state, their 2-day incarceration, and the general hostility of their jailers. They immediately tried to buck up the new prisoners by singing "The Red Flag," a wobbly anthem. "Then raise the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds we'll live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying." "Shut your mouths in there," boomed the voice of Sergeant Loomis. He came stumping along the aisle, peeled down to his singlet and chewing a cigar. He looked less like a kindly uncle, more like everyone's bad relative. Loomis raked his billy along the bars. "Welcome to Fresno Jail, boys. 4 of you been here before, but we got a new one with us today. Come up here, Mr. Raghead." Mukherjee obeyed wanly. Blood had dried brown under his bruised nose, and a large purple-yellow ring was forming around his right eye. "Sir, that is an offensive term," he said, staying out of reach of Loomis's billy. "We demand our rights, also the presence of an attorney." The sergeant furiously chewed the end of his cigar and whacked the bars with the billy. "Oh, you demand, do you? Well, Mr. Raghead, I'll tell you what we do with hotheads who demand things in Fresno. We cool 'em down with a little something called the water cure." The scarecrow, calling himself Woodrow Wilson, stepped forward. "Loomis, Father Marquez is desperately sick. If you turn more water on him—" "He ain't no father. He's a goddamn communist agitator," Loomis interrupted. "The water it is." Woodrow Wilson grabbed the bars. "You're liable to kill him." Loomis put his palm over Woodrow Wilson's face and shoved. "Good. That'll be one less wobbly. Elmer, let's unroll that fire hose in here. Get a couple more of the boys. Time to give Mr. Raghead a Fresno jail welcome." The fire hose snaked all the way into the cell area from a hydrant outside the jail's back door. A jailer turned on the hydrant, and the cannon blast of water blew the unsuspecting Mukherjee off his feet. The other 3 prisoners crouched around Marquez, trying to shield him. In the long run, it helped not at all. The wobblies were sprayed for 15 minutes, then given a half-hour's respite and sprayed again. Loomis and the jailers kept at it throughout the afternoon. Other cops drifted in from time to time, most of them wearing black rubber waders. The jail cells were not designed for drainage. By 7 p.m., the corridors and all the cells were a foot deep in water. At 8:30, Sergeant Loomis excused himself. His wife and 6 children were waiting supper. Going out, he called, "Keep it up, boys. The longer the better." Gopal Mukherjee crouched in the water. He'd removed his turban and slipped it under his shirt in an effort to save it. Strings of hair hung over his brown forehead, and his face had lost its cheery innocence. He gazed at the jail corridor with shocked rage. How could human beings retaliate so cruelly for the mere existence of a right guaranteed to all citizens of this beautiful state? The jailer named Elmer opened 3 high windows at the end of a corridor, and chilly night air swept in. Soaked, Gopal Mukherjee began to shiver, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Behind him, Marquez raved on the bunk, barely conscious. A cop thrust the fire hose through the bars. "Another bath, you lice. Before we're done, we'll clean you up real good." Water shot from the nozzle and hit Gopal Mukherjee with enough force to stagger him. In one corner, Woodrow Wilson, Leland Stanford, and John L. Sullivan groveled against the wall. "Stop it, I had enough," Leland Stanford wailed as the stream beat and bruised him. Gopal Mukherjee glared at him through the roaring spray. He wouldn't be so cowardly. He would fight this outrageous cruelty, and not in the passive way that had proved itself futile. The dirt road ran east and west, baking in the sunshine. To the east lay the Bowls, to the west the hamlet of Raisin. Arbors stretched north and south into the hazy distance. Men in straw hats and loose white clothes worked among the vines. Gopal Mukherjee staggered along, supporting Marquez. The former priest's black suit was incredibly filthy, and Mukherjee wasn't much cleaner. Sweat streamed down Marquez's face. His purblind eyes slitted against the sun's glare. Sergeant Loomis had personally broken Marquez's eyeglasses and thrown away the frames. Suddenly Marquez's legs gave out. "Oh, dear me," Mukherjee exclaimed, struggling. The weight was too much, and Marquez tumbled in the dust, rolling halfway down the side of a roadside ditch. Frightened, Mukherjee knelt beside his fallen comrade. Unfastening the end of his soiled turban, he unwound it until it was long enough to reach Marquez's face, then blotted the perspiration. He could feel the heat of his comrade's sickness. Mukherjee rocked back on his haunches, casting a forlorn eye at the flat valley and endless arbors. Silent workers saw the pair but made no move to aid them. Gopal Mukherjee felt a renewed rage and sorrow. He was alone and lost in this cruel land he'd entered with such soaring hope. He didn't know what to do. A shadow fell over Marquez's greasy cheek. The man who stood there was about 70, small and wiry, with a dark leathery face and big work-hardened hands. He removed his straw hat and regarded the fallen man and Mukherjee. "Buenos dias, senor. Soy Ramon Obregon." "Please, I don't understand. Only English." "I said I am Ramon Obregon, in charge of these men." He gave a nod at the nearby field workers. "What happened to this man?" "He was speaking in Fresno. They locked us in the jail and gave us their water cure. They let us out 2 days ago." 2 days and you're only this far south of Fresno. It isn't even 10 miles. "I know, but he can't go fast. Just a few steps, then he falters. The fever and now the belly sickness. They're eating him away." "Yes, I can smell the result of the belly sickness." Ramon Obregon crouched down, waving his straw hat gently between his knees and watching the hot silver sky. "Not good for working men to speak in this part of the valley, not unless they confine themselves to saying, 'Yes, sir.' So I am learning." Obregon touched Marquez's forehead. "Christ save us. It's like a hot coal." "Yes, sir. I fear that if he does not have a doctor and medicine, he'll die." "You are right, I think." Again the elderly Mexican scanned the hazy flatland. "The padron of my ranch would not summon a doctor for him, that much I know. But we can make a place for him in our barracks. It's better than most. You get on that side and help me lift him." The frame barracks, occupying one side of a large, treeless yard a mile from the Bowls Raisin Road, baked in the hot sun. Dragging Marquez between them, Obregon and Mukherjee crossed the yard, passing a water trough with an upright spigot at the end. Obregon's eyes moved back and forth watchfully. In the distance, bright fans of water churned from noisy pumps, irrigating the arbors. Farther away, a huge, chugging Hart-Parr tractor plowed a fallow field, its great steel tires giving off occasional flashes in the sun. Marquez's eyelids fluttered. Sensing that someone was helping him, he tried to move his feet and slipped from Mukherjee's grasp, dropping on his side in the yellow dust.
"Pick him up quickly," Obregon whispered. "The padron rides the property every day about this hour. He mustn't see this man. You either. He'd turn you out."
"No," Mukherjee said.
"What's that?"
"I said no. He won't turn us out."
"You're sure, are you?" Obregon said crossly.
"Yes, I am sure. You see, this man was once a Roman Catholic priest, a holy man full of Christian love. He taught the Wobblies to be passive and not fight back when attacked. I learned quickly that he was wrong. Before we left Fresno, I went to our friend Mr. Frank Little. He gave me something." Gopal Mukherjee undid 2 buttons of his sweat-soaked shirt. The astonished Obregon saw a small revolver concealed against the man's belly.
"I have bullets, too," Mukherjee said. "No one will move Diego until he's better."
Obregon stared at the Hindustani with a keen new appreciation. Then the sight of a dust plume down a side road roused him.
"It's the padron, Tarbox. Let's get him inside. We can argue later."
They dragged Diego Marquez to the barracks stoop, where a stout black-haired woman and 2 barefoot children regarded the activity with mild surprise. Obregon gestured for her to open the heavy door. As the sound of a horse grew audible, they hauled Marquez from the blinding sunlight through the shade of the stoop to the cool dark of the interior. The woman closed the door from outside, leaning against the whitewashed siding and the painted wooden sign, which said Cuartel, beneath a faded JMC cartouche. 83. On March 6th, Fremont Older called at Greenwich Street. Mac had come north at the end of February. Now he received his friend in the first-floor office.
"No more stays, no more appeals. Tomorrow's the day," Older said. "Abe Roof finally goes to San Quentin. It's taken long enough. I grant you that. I thought you'd like to come down to the county jail to watch the transfer. The caravan leaves at 12:30.
What do you mean, caravan?
It's turning into a blasted carnival. Reporters cordially invited. Honest Abe is the biggest and most celebrated con ever to be locked up in Q. His cellmates can't wait to meet him. He's already lined up a cushy job in the jute mill.
I'll be there if I can. Mac jotted a note. In the next room, a telephone rang. Alex Muller's muffled voice could be heard answering. Older tapped the arm of the visitor's chair.
"The transfer isn't the only reason I came by. I want to be open with you and Rudy and everyone else in the reform group."
"Open about what?"
"Roof's 14-year sentence will net down to 9 years with good behavior. The present rule states that a prisoner isn't eligible for parole until half the sentence is served. I intend to campaign to get that rule set aside. I'm going to use the full resources of the Bulletin."
Mac leaned back. "I don't believe I'm hearing this."
"Abe Roof has been tried and convicted. He's a ruined man. His political apparatus is destroyed. He'll never wield power again. Why humiliate him?"
"Because he's a damn crook who bled this city for years."
"And we drew his blood, too. We needn't wallow in it."
From a card case, Older brought a folded sheet of paper, which he gave to Mac. "What's this?"
"Notes for an editorial."
Mac deciphered Older's hand with difficulty. One needs a strong sense of self-righteousness to hold the key to another man's cell. One should be very sure of his own rectitude before he feels a pharisaical gladness over the humiliation of Abe Roof. "Fremont, what is this? What's going on?"
"Business, Mac. Business is what's going on. I went to Roof's cell yesterday and arranged a deal with him. As soon as he's settled in prison, he'll start drafting his memoirs, to be published exclusively in the Bulletin."
Mac's mouth dropped. First came a searing anger, and he was about to remind Older that Rufe's hirelings had lamed Jim. Then a sad and cynical resignation sapped the impulse. Jim was gone. "What's your angle?" he said instead. "Confessions of a repentant boss?" Older ignored the sarcasm. "Exactly." "Good Lord." Mac shook his head. Alex Muller banged the door back in his haste to enter the room. "Sir, it's Jesse Tarbox on the wire. Extremely urgent." "Excuse me a minute." After Mac left, Fremont Older took the opportunity to slip out the front way with scarcely a sound. "Found them this morning," Jesse Tarbox said. His sinewy face was red and sun-blistered. His khaki shirt sweated through at the armpits and across the back. He wrapped his riding crop on his thigh. "Two of them. Wobblies run out of Fresno. One's a crazy raghead, the other a spick named Marquez. The raghead's packing a pistol." He listened. "Actually, it was my segundo, Mr. Keeter, who found them." Over by the office door, Homer Keeter stood idly scratching his crotch. He was a sandy-haired lout with a broom straw in the corner of his mouth. "We're trying to keep it quiet. Christ knows what some of the hotheads around here would do if they found out. Tar and feather me first, probably. The problem is the raghead's got that gun, and he says I can't touch the spick because he's bad sick. On top of that, he's a priest, or he used to be. Can you feature that? A wobbly priest?" He listened. "That's right, Marquez." He listened. "No, sir, I can't just order them out. I tried." Homer Keeter snorted. He'd been the one sent into the barracks with orders for the Wobblies to vacate. Tarbox listened. "God damn it, Mr. Chance, that isn't fair. I didn't just let it happen. My best foreman, Obregon, he picked them up and took them in. I'd like to flay the hide off Obregon, but he's got 18 relatives in that barracks, and I'm scared of every one of them." He listened. "I know it's my responsibility, but I don't know what the hell to do," he shouted. "That's why I called." He listened, slapping his crop against his riding breeches. "All right, sir." "Yes, sir." "I'll sit tight until you get here, but please make it fast." "Yes, sir." Jesse Tarbox hung up the earpiece carelessly, and it fell off the hook, banging the wall at the end of its cord. When he tried to hang it up again, he broke the hook. Swearing, he let the earpiece dangle. "I don't know why I work for that snotty son of a bitch." "'Cause he pays top dollar, that's why." "He's coming down here personally." "I gathered." "Be here sometime tomorrow." "Well, he better hurry, because we got 50 greasers in that barracks, and you can't count on all of them keeping their mouths shut. Any of our neighbors find out we're hiding 2 Wobblies on this ranch, we are in trouble." "Shit, that's what I told him," Jesse Tarbox said. He hit his crop on the desk so hard Homer Keeter jumped. Mac checked the timetables. All the trains in the next few hours were locals, so he decided it would be faster to drive the Packard. He made good time for a while, but south of Stockton, just across the Stanislaus County line, a tire blew out. The Packard's headlamps veered wildly toward the left, and as the auto bounded for the shoulder, Mac hauled on the wheel to keep it out of the ditch. The rear end slewed. He tramped on the brake and killed the engine. The Packer shook once and settled, an enormous cloud of tan dust slowly ascending into the purple twilight. He heard coyotes barking in the distance. He'd sure as hell guessed wrong about taking the car. He could either change the tire and keep driving, or hike to the nearest depot and wait. He certainly wasn't going to hike and wait. Mac threw his fedora on the seat next to him and leaned his forehead on the wheel. The cool evening air laved his face. He felt grubby from hours of driving and hungry, but he'd brought no food. There was a dairy barn about half a mile on, and he wondered if he could catch a drink of milk or a butt of bread. But first he had to change the tire. He climbed out, shed his coat, and undid his cravat. The western light winked on the blued metal of his shopkeeper's Colt. The delay didn't improve his mood. Repeatedly, the wrench or the wheel nuts slipped from his arthritic hands. All in all, it took him over half an hour. When he finally got to the dairy farm, he paid for a quart of milk and a loaf of bread and was allowed to crawl up in the hay mow for an hour. Then he drove on through the vast star-strewn night. He had a powerful sense of a tide flowing against him. At the Merced River crossing in Merced County, he found the bridge blocked by carpenters repairing sections of bridge floor that had collapsed under a wagon load of quarry stone. Mac swore and drove miles out of his way, up to Snelling. There he drove onto a barge that ferried him over the river. It was 12:30 p.m. and too hot for March. The gritty wind had a parched smell, as if it were August. He sweated and drove without rest, without food, steadily south. Above Chowchilla, a Madera County deputy on horseback came galloping from a side road, firing shots in the air. Mac stopped, and the deputy arrested him for reckless speeding. Mac showed identification, then named his companies and some of his connections in the state. It meant nothing. The rural magistrate and the deputy had never heard of him. He thought of Abe Roof. How would he handle this? He offered the magistrate and deputy bribes of $100 each, and they suddenly became cordial and helpful, the deputy directing him to a decent cafe, the magistrate inviting him to relax in the swing on his front porch. Mac stifled his sulphurous rage and said no. At 3:30, on the raw edge of exhaustion, he continued south. The Packard roared into the dusty yard in the red sundown. With the day's fieldwork finished, families were together, barefoot children chasing each other around the trough and pump, a naked infant crawling to and fro, an imposing rooster pecking at nothing, a wiry yellow hound chasing its tail and yapping. The air smelled of warm earth and spicy cooking. The picture of dishevelment, Mac flung himself out of the Packard and strode inside the barracks. A majority of the field workers recognized him, the women smiling shyly and the men knuckling their foreheads. Mac fumed. He assumed Tarbox was responsible for the subservience. The building consisted of clean, Spartan living spaces off a hall that ran down its length. Some of the living spaces consisted of 3 rooms, some, for the bachelors, only 1. Everything was freshly whitewashed, and ceiling fixtures provided electric light. The second floor was identical. Up there, halfway down the corridor, Mac spied a young man in a turban standing in a doorway. He was brown, but not Mexican. Mac went straight past him, noticing his wary look, and into the 2-room space. The sight of Diego Marquez was a shock. He lay on a bunk, fat, sallow, and sick. Mac smelled the sweat soaking his cotton nightshirt. He knelt by his old acquaintance and rested his palm on Marquez's forehead. An elderly Mexican appeared at the door and stepped in. "Soy Ramon Obregon. Buenos tardes, señor." "Chance." "Ya sé. Lo he visto en fotografías." They shook hands, the young Indian peeking over Obregon's shoulder. Marquez snorted and rolled his head back and forth. Then he calmed and began to snore with his mouth open. Continuing in Spanish, Mac said, "His fever must be 104. "It has been thus for several days," Obregon said. "I expected him to die. He refuses. He is a big man, powerful like a bull. But he can't last like this. I'll get a doctor out here." "That is good," said Mukherjee in such perfect English that Mac was startled. "Diego is an excellent man, but they hate him very much in Fresno, almost as much as they hate all Hindustani." "You are the one who brought him here?" "I am, sir." "How did he get this way?" "He was arrested for speaking. They sprayed us with the cold water hose all night in the Fresno jail. Diego had suffered it once before. He was already sick. I brought him out of town." "I found him on the main road and took them in," Obregon explained. "You had no business doing that, no authority to do that," Mac said it sharply, out of both weariness and a desire that this problem would just vanish. Visible disappointment clouded Obregon's face. He had heard better of J.M. Chance. "No authority, perhaps," he replied quietly, "but a duty." The old man's eyes showed no subservience, no intimidation. Mac retreated. "All right, I'll accept that. No authority to do it, but every reason. I'll drive up to Tarbox's office and phone for a doctor. Let's just keep this quiet. I don't need any grief from the other ranchers. They think I'm too radical as it is." That brought a wearied smile from Obregon. "I understand. It is radical to build this barracks with proper wood floors instead of dirt. Radical to provide decent privies instead of open trenches or nothing. It is radical to house your people here instead of crowding them in the usual tents and hovels. Radical indeed, sir." Mac and the old Mexican eyed one another, silently making peace. Marquez groaned in his sleep. The red of sunset faded away outside the window. Mukherjee reached up to the cord of the tin-shaded electric bulb and snapped it on. Mac walked downstairs and into the yard, all dusky now. He wrinkled his nose at the odors of dirt and sweat left on him by the long journey. Things were still all wrong. He didn't like harboring wobblies, no matter who they were. His body felt as heavy as granite as he dragged to the water trough. He turned the spigot, stood away from the splash, and filled the dipper. The water was cool and sweet. He tilted the dipper and ran some over his chin, then spilled more over his forehead, licking it as it dripped from his nose. When he opened his eyes, he saw the Indian on the stoop under an electric light. The man walked over quickly. "Mr. Chance, sir. One moment, please, before you leave. I am Mr. Gopal Mukherjee, sir. In my home village, Chandpur, in the Punjab, I learned to be a #1 first-rate farmer. I sailed by steerage to Canada, where I harvested wheat. Then I traveled down to California, where others from my region also work. I like it so much, despite the hatred I found in Fresno. I will be a Californian now." Tired and annoyed all over again, Mac didn't know what to make of this foreigner. "I can't talk now," he said. "Just please one more moment, sir. I am a very good hard worker, an absolute top man with crops of all sorts, including muscat and muscatel raisin grapes, which I see you grow in quantity." "For God's sake, Mukherjee, this is no time—" "Why not, sir? I am eager, industrious, honest. Give me a job, sir." Mac leaned on the pump. "Look, they don't like your kind in the valley. Didn't Fresno teach you that? They also don't like anyone who hires Indians. I said inside, and I'll repeat it. I don't need more grief. I have plenty. You'll have to go somewhere else." "But, sir, I guarantee you will find me a most capable #1 man. Working hard for you on this ranch, any long hours you ask. I could save enough to bring my prospective wife from Chandpur. I have great hope that we could prosper here in California." "You'll have to go somewhere else. Now get inside, out of sight." "Sir." Mac clanged the dipper on the pump. "No job." The Indian stared at Mac as he hung up the dipper and turned toward the Packard. Then Mukherjee plucked the dipper off the hook and twisted the spigot. Somehow that was too much. Mac spun around and knocked the dipper out of Mukherjee's hand. The tinned metal flashed as the dipper landed in dust. "God damn it, I told you, get inside." "Sir, not even a drink of water first?" An enormous stillness seemed to descend on the yard. The two of them stood well away from the stoop, in the dark, barely touched by the electric light. A narrow, luminous aura of yellow and white defined the peaks of the coast mountains. Mac saw nothing of the surroundings, only a hopeful young wanderer at a meandering brown stream. He saw Swampy Hellman on horseback, denying the interloper a simple necessity and comfort. "Sir." Mac rubbed his mouth, then walked over and picked up the fallen dipper. With an unconscious solemnity, he handed it to Gopal Mukherjee. The two men stared at one another. Gopal Mukherjee turned on the spigot. "What the hell have I become? How is it that I've forgotten so much? Is it age? Money? Frustration? Sorrow?" Whatever it was, Mac was ashamed. While water splashed in the trough, Jesse Tarbox galloped along a dirt track into the yard. Red and excited, he waved his riding crop over his head as he reined. "Homer Keeter saw you drive in, Mr. Chance. There's headlights on the main road. Whole damn bunch of cars." Mac sprinted to the Packard and jumped on the rear bumper, then the trunk. From that height he could see across the field to the Bowles Raisin Road. Sure enough, bobbing and flashing, headlights stabbed the rolling dust. Mac counted 5, 6, 7 pairs of lights coming in a column from the east, from the Fresno Pike. Tarbox pranced his nervous mare toward the auto. "Whoa, Sal, calm down, blast you." The foreman slapped the mare savagely with the reins, drawing blood. "Why are we suddenly entertaining visitors, Jesse?" "Somebody must have talked in town." Gopal Mukherjee ran to the Packard and, without invitation, stood on the bumper. He said to Mac, "I will not be moved, sir, not until my friend and companion is well." He yanked his shirt out of his pants and palmed a small pistol. God almighty, everything is falling apart. Tarbox sounded close to hysterical when he said, "7 cars means a lot of men. They might burn us out, kill people. Why don't you hand over those 2? Mac was tempted. He wished the burden would pass, but it wouldn't. "Why don't you shut your mouth, Jesse? Ride to the office and get me the shotgun." He jumped back down off the car, throwing off his coat and pulling the shopkeeper's Colt off his hip. After opening the cylinder to check the loads, Mac jumped back up on the Packard's front bumper. Now he heard as well as saw the caravan. Snarling and roaring, the autos turned one by one into the lane leading to the heart of his property. Mac waited at the water trough. He'd sent Jesse Tarbox back to the office again with orders to stand by the telephone. He tugged the holster around to his right hip where he could reach it quickly. In the crook of his arm rested the ranch shotgun, an 8-gauge Ithaca with a modified choke on both barrels. The single line of autos came on toward the yard, their headlights stabbing through boiling dust clouds. To Mac, in his tired state, they sounded like hungry, evil-tempered mountain cats. The light of the first car blinded him a moment. 4 or 5 men were packed into the black Ford T-model. It veered left into the yard, then right again, its lights splashing the front of the barracks as it stopped. One by one, the other 6 cars pulled up alongside each other. Mac was staring at 14 headlights. He locked his knees so his legs wouldn't shake. He didn't want them to see how frightened he was. Doors on the cars sprang open and men in coveralls and cheap suits piled out. Stringy redneck Fresno County farmers and town merchants with derbies and high collars. Mac knew most of them, including Sergeant Phil Loomis from the police department, out of uniform, and the man who stepped out in front as if he were the leader, a bald and paunchy wheat rancher named Peter Sledgeman. Sledgeman walked to the water trough with a wary eye on Mac, the others forming up behind him. Mac's quick count came to 23. Work-gnarled hands clutched axe handles and 2x4s. He saw no guns. Mac nodded in acknowledgement to the spokesman. "Pete?" "Mac?" "What can I do for you?" "I expect you know. You're harboring 2 men we want." Mac's round eyeglasses flashed in the headlight glare, his hair shining white as new cotton. Sibilant Spanish was audible in the barracks. He'd ordered everyone inside, away from the open windows, and he hoped to heaven they'd obeyed. "I said you've got 2 men we—" "Calm down, Pete, I heard you. Is it them you want or me?" Sledgeman smiled coldly. "Well, yes, there's that. You never have run with the crowd around here. Always made your neighbors look bad, out of step. Take this blasted barracks. Tents aren't good enough for your stoop labor." "That's right, not good enough. What else, Pete?" "Those 2 Reds. Hand 'em over and we'll have no trouble." "Hand them over. What for? Another water cure at the jailhouse? Or is it a lynch rope this time?" "Don't stall us, Mac. We know they're inside.
One of Ramon Obregon's cousins swallowed a lot of tequila in town and shot off his mouth. I'm not denying they're here, but you can't take them. I gave them shelter, and you boys are the reason why. I'll thank you to remember this is my property, Pete. I want you to vacate it right now. Go home, cool off." Another farmer, Carl Cass, stepped in front of the lights of his Rio. Cass's neck was genuinely red from working his melon fields. He chewed tobacco, stains showed all over his overall bib. Mac had once loaned Cass $500 for emergency medical bills for his little girl Clarice. There was no memory of that in Cass's snake-mean stare, nor any when he shouted, "You're crazy, Chance. Why are you protecting a couple of damn Reds who'd just as soon steal all your money and your land, too?" Some in the crowd muttered and said, "Yes," or "Tell him, Cass." "Listen, Carl," Mac said. "I like the Wobblies about as much as you do, which is not very much. But speech-making never hurt anybody. Something reminds me that American people are allowed to make speeches anywhere they please, on just about any subject. If that argument doesn't move you, try this one. I know one of the two men from way back. He's wasting away with fever and probably pneumonia, liable to die if I don't get a doctor in here. A human life's more important than money or land." A farmer leaning on a shiny green fender snickered. "Since when?" "Might as well forget about calling a doctor or anybody else," Sledgeman said. "We stopped half a mile up the road and Lynn Sutter shinnied up the phone pole and cut the line. We also sent one more car down the back road with its lights out. There's a few good boys in the field behind this place in case anybody gets a notion to run that way." A knife twisted in Mac's middle, and his mouth turned dry and juiceless. Sledgeman ran his tongue over horsey yellow teeth, then settled his frayed old straw hat a little more firmly. "I think you just better let us have those two, Mac." He walked around the trough, headed for the stoop. Mac lined up the shotgun on Sledgeman's gut. Sledgeman stopped, and so did the muttering from the others. "Pete, I don't want to fire this, but I will if you push. You want those men, you'll have to take me first. I guarantee I'll take some of you with me." Sledgeman chewed his lower lip and eyed Mac up and down, gauging his determination. Finally, the farmer leaned over and expelled a big, shiny blob of spit right into the dust in front of Mac's shoes. "You're violating the law, Mac." "What the hell do you mean?" Carl Cass shouted the answer. "Sheriff Chittenden deputized us, every man, Jack." "Except me. I already got a badge," Sergeant Loomis said to general laughter. Mac rubbed an index finger over his chin. He could hear the rasp of his beard, growing out dark as a twilight shadow. He hadn't touched a razor since leaving the city. "So you see, Mac—" "Nothing, Pete. I see nothing." "If we want those two, we got the authority." "I'd like to see a warrant, some legal paper." Men shifted their feet and muttered again. "This deputy talk is bullshit, Pete, and we both know it. But I really don't care one way or another. You'll bleed just as much deputized as not." He held the double-barrel Ithaca a little higher, the blued metal shining in the headlights. Sledgeman finally answered him with a shrug. "We can wait you out. We can wait all night. We can wait a week. We're going to make an example of that greaser and the raghead. Examples for the whole damn valley." "The whole state," an Armenian farmer named Pazian yelled, drawing a lot of noisy approval from the others. Sledgeman turned around and trudged back to the autos. Loomis and a few others huddled around him, whispering. Mac walked backward to the dim pool of electric light on the stoop. "Anyone there?" From the darkness of the hall came the reply. "Aye, sir, Mr. Mukherjee." "Try the telephone on the wall. Let me know if it's working." Mac waited. "No, sir, I do not think so." Swearing, Mac sat down on the stoop and leaned back against the siding. "Turn out this light." Mukherjee snapped it off.
Mac watched the farmers and townsmen gesturing and arguing in front of the parked automobiles. He'd never been one to waste his money on gambling, but if this were poker, it was a pretty sure bet that he held the losing hand. Ticking. A steady ticking. His head jerked up. He dozed off. A cock crowed somewhere. Clouds like white veils trailed across the stars. The ticking kept on. He remembered where he was and wished he hadn't. Hours ago, he'd put on his suit coat for warmth, but he was freezing, his hands raw and cold. When he exhaled, he could see his breath faintly. The Ithaca rested on his knees. The ticking, he realized now, came from his 24-karat gold pocket watch. Bought and engraved before the earthquake, it bore the JMC crest on the lid. The barracks raced north. To the east, light was breaking over the valley floor. Mac picked up the watch and tilted it to put some light on the dial. 5:30. He yawned and wiggled his stiff legs. The auto lamps had been turned off long ago, and the men had piled into the cars to doze, or had curled up on the ground. As the light brightened, Mac saw an arm stretched out here, heard a yawn there. They were rousing. Behind the barracks, a sudden explosive hiss signaled the start of another irrigation cycle. Jesse Tarbox had thrown the switch in the office 3/4 of a mile away. It might as well have been in China. Slowly, the men in the mob woke up and greeted each other. Someone's muffled words were answered with a laugh. That commonplace sound made Mac feel even more alone. He heard a rustling behind him. Inside, the creak of a stool being moved. Mukherjee had sat there all night, sharing the vigil like a servant attending his master. With his pistol, it was a total of 2 handguns and a shotgun against 23. Not good enough. Loomis gathered Cass and Sledgeman and 5 others, and once again made a show of conferring. They stood in front of the Model T, where Mac could see them clearly, which was their intent. All night he'd cudgeled his mind for a way out of this, a way to forestall violence. He considered Tarbox worthless in this kind of emergency, and Homer Keeter, too. Mukherjee had volunteered to try a dash through the fields for help, but Mac had vetoed it. To whom could they appeal? Maybe the Fresno City and county authorities hadn't encouraged this marauding, but they'd surely look the other way, whatever happened. No other help was available. Sledgeman seemed to be talking loudest in the group by the Model T. He smacked a fist in his palm. "No, right now." Loomis shrugged, and after some more argument, Sledgeman put on his straw hat and stumped out to the water trough. "Chance?" "Yes." "You listen. We played your game all night, but the boys are hungry and cold, and they want to get this over with. You aren't going to be reasonable. We aren't either. We brung some spare tins of gas with us. If you won't deliver those 2, we'll punish them right here. Fry their hides inside the barracks. Cook 'em alive, and your mech's help in the bargain." "Pete, there are women in the barracks." "I know that. Youngsters. Mac, it's your choice. If they die, the guilt's on your head." "You'll have to get up close to start a fire." "We will. You can put some shot in some of us, but not all of us." A vein in Mac's forehead stood out like blue string. He didn't want to contemplate how bad, how truly bad this could be if they carried out the threat. "Mukherjee," he said over his shoulder. "Sir." "Are they still watching the back, too?" "Yes, sir. I looked not 10 minutes ago." Mac stood up, shivering, but not from the chill. With his knee joints cracking and popping, he walked rapidly to the corner of the barracks and looked down the wall to the arbors. There he discerned 3 men, widely spaced about 50 yards beyond the barracks. One carried a piece of bar iron. Mac heard the slosh of liquid. Across the yard, Cass was lugging a 5-gallon gas can out in front of the parked autos. A second man behind him had another. Mac ran back to the stoop, his palms slippery on the shotgun. Sergeant Phil Loomis found an axe handle. Someone else produced a rag. Loomis tied the rag around one end of the handle and Cass poured gas over it. Loomis stepped well away from the gas containers, holding the axe handle at arm's length and averting his face. A man struck a match and threw it, and the rag ignited with a whoosh and gush of flame. After the flames settled, Loomis hoisted the improvised torch and started on a path to the water trough. Inside the barracks, a woman pleaded in Spanish for her children to gather close and hold on to her. Mac cocked the shotgun. "Far enough, Phil." "No, sir, I got police authority. You pull the trigger on me, you'll hang." Loomis kept walking. "Phil," Mac said in a raw voice. Cass shouted, "Don't worry, Phil. He ain't got the balls to kill you cold." Bastards, bastards. They knew him. They started to edge forward, all of them, all across the row of parked autos. The sun was coming up. It promised to be a mild, sweet California day. "One last time, Phil. Stay back. This is senseless. A lot of people will be hurt for nothing." Sledgeman yelled, "I don't think keeping the radical unions out of California is nothing, you cocksucker." There were shouts, "Right, by God. Kill him. And every last one of his greasers." Mac wanted to weep with rage. He never imagined it would degenerate to this. But Loomis kept walking, straight on past the water trough. Mac rammed the shotgun against his shoulder, taking aim. Loomis stared him in the eye from 15 paces away. Mac fancied he could feel the heat of the burning rag. Then only 10 paces. Do it. Shoot him. And 7. And 5. Shoot him. Loomis broke into a wide grin. "You're a stinking yella coward, Chance." Loomis wound up to throw the flaming axe handle through a window. Mac hardened his heart and touched the trigger. Another sound ruptured the silence, a sound louder than the sprayers in the arbors. "Reinforcements!" somebody yelled. "Shit, no. We rounded up everybody who wanted to come," Sledgeman said. Mac's crooked finger caressed the trigger. Then, squinting, he saw something unbelievable. Loomis turned around and saw it too. It was as if a little SNA film of the previous night was playing on a screen. 5 autos in a line roared down the Bulls Raisin Road and turned left into the property with headlights blazing. "What the hell's going on?" Loomis shouted. The fiery axe handle burned too close to his hand and he threw it in the trough. There was a fierce hiss and a squiggle of smoke in the air, and then nothing but the snarl and growl of the autos coming on through the dust clouds. A gilt star decorated the side of the first auto, along with the word sheriff. Looks of panic spread on the faces of the farmers and townsmen as the big black Stoddard Dayton slewed around the parked cars and braked in front of them. The 4 other vehicles pulled up behind, blocking the road. Men jumped out, talking, yelling questions. City men from the cut of their clothes. The sheriff heaved himself out of his car, tugging up his pistol belt against his sizable belly. He was bow-legged and walked as though his boots pinched. Gray hair showed beneath a creamy Montana peak hat. He spoke with the aggrieved air of a schoolmaster in a room of rowdies. "Everybody put down those clubs. Chance, put away that shotgun. Loomis, what the devil is an officer of the law doing mixed up in this?" "They said you deputized them, Chittenden," Mac said. Sheriff Chittenden looked even more aggravated. "They're damned liars. They'd say anything to get their licks at you, I expect." The men fingered their axe handles and 2x4s. Sledgeman narrowed his eyes as Mukherjee peered cautiously from the doorway, his pistol in hand. Sheriff Chittenden dragged out his revolver, a homely old .44-40 Colt Frontier model, and fired a shot over his head. The echo rolled away above the sunlit arbors. "I said put everything down. That's an order. Barney, Al, if they won't, arrest them." "You heard him, gents," said a voice. The speaker was the first of a pair of deputies, younger men with boyish faces, who had slipped between the parked autos. One carried an old Winchester Express, the other a later model 3030. After the deputies grabbed a couple of baseball bats and tossed them, the rest of the men pitched their weapons down voluntarily. Pazian and a few others looked relieved in a guilty sort of way. The city men moved near the farmers and townsmen. Mac saw checkered suits, spats, fancy watch chains. Sledgeman swatted his leg with his straw hat. "Chittenden, who the hell are these dudes?" From the pads and pencils in evidence, Mac knew. "San Francisco reporters, Pete," Sheriff Chittenden said. Sledgeman failed to understand the warning. "Came in on a special train at 4:30 this morning." "How the hell did they find out about it?" an angry farmer demanded. A reporter with a waxed mustache and a radish of a nose marched right up to him. "Well, I'll explain that, Reuben." "Listen here," the farmer sputtered. "One of your loquacious country cousins must have mouthed it around town, because somebody sent a telegram from the depot, maybe somebody who thinks this sort of sport is pretty barbaric. The message flashed from Sacramento to San Francisco, and my city editor dragged me out of Shays Market Street Saloon and said there was likely to be a shootout or a lynching here in the sticks. The Examiner hired a special train within the hour. That's it in a nutshell, Reuben." The farmer glared. "You goddamn city wiseacre, my name ain't Reuben." "Well, whatever," the reporter said with a shrug. "Sounds like it's a crackerjack story you've got here. Wobbly's besieged. King Mob and Prime Minister Arson reign in Fresno County. Yes, sir. Could be bigger than Muscle Slough." Sledgeman stomped over to Mac and leaned close. "Hadn't it been for you, we'd have those two. Nobody'll forget this." "I hope you're right." Sheriff Chittenden brandished his Colt. "Now I'm going to say this just once, and everybody better listen. All you boys from around here, you climb in your cars and vamoose. Some of the rest of you move those cars in the lane so they can leave. Collect the bunch out back, too. This party's over." "Sheriff, we came a devil of a long way. We've got to talk to these people," a reporter said. Chittenden considered that. "All right, 5 minutes, that's all." The new arrivals went shooting among the locals like pool balls ricocheting after a break. One farmer took a swing at a reporter. A couple of others couldn't wait to start telling their side. "These are newspaper journalists?" Gopal Mukherjee asked Mac. "That's right, from San Francisco." The Indian thrust his pistol into his pants, grinned, and dashed for the nearest of them. Tension drained out of Mac's hands and shoulders, leaving him spent and fighting a yawn. He laid the Ithaca shotgun beside the trough and leaned forward to dip his face in the water, which rippled with highlights from the morning sun. After immersing his face, he straightened up and shook like a puppy coming out of a creek. Then, opening his eyes, he saw a reporter in a skirt and shirtwaist stepping around the hood of the parked Model T. "Nellie!" He was so astonished he couldn't move, just stood there with water dripping from his cheeks and chin. His face was pale and puffy from lack of sleep, and her hair showed more gray than he remembered. She watched him with a strange, tremulous, almost tearful expression. Gopal Mukherjee plunged among the reporters, aggressively shaking hands. "How do you do, sirs? I am Gopal Mukherjee, a very good #1 agriculturist and Californian. I wish to say that were it not for that gentleman, Mr. Chance, we would certainly all be dead, or worse. He is a very brave gentleman, for whom I hope to work for many years to come." "You work for him now, is that it?" Gopal Mukherjee swiftly looked at Mac. Mac called, "Yes." Mukherjee's grin shone like the sun. Mac ran to Nellie and flung his arms around her. "Mac, good Lord!" She gasped and struggled. He had a strong grip on her waist. Her slim body felt wonderful under his hands, wonderful and right. "I have a dispatch to write and file." He paid no attention, forcing her to the side of the Model T and kissing her. Though the kiss lasted only seconds, by the end of it, she relaxed in his arms. "What are you doing here?" He felt giddy as a schoolboy, miraculously reprieved from exhaustion. "You heard what Kipper Harkness said a minute ago. The story got on the wire from Fresno. I was in the city last night, ready to sit down to dinner with an old friend from the Examiner. They got a telephone call from the city room, and you were mentioned. Within 20 minutes, the paper decided to hire a train. I had to come along." She studied the barracks. Workers and their wives and children crowded the stoop and upstairs windows. "You are defending Indian labor now? That's a whole new side of you." "I don't think so. You know I've always had a passion for underdogs. That young man Mukherjee is one. He was treated brutally in Fresno. Marquez, too. Mukherjee brought Marquez here." "Diego Marquez?" "That's right, he's inside." Mac leaned against the Ford's fender. "Before you go to work, I want to tell you something. I'm worn out from dealing with all this by myself. All these people and their problems." He rubbed at his damp face and decided to take the risk. He tried to couch it lightly, though he suspected she could see how tense he was. She could probably hear his heart beating. "I wouldn't mind laying back for a while, Nellie. I mean a good, long while. I wouldn't mind having a wife who could support me with her writing." "Eh." Nellie formed the W with her lips, then astonishment silenced her. "Wife, Nellie. Wife." "Damn you." Her eyes filled with tears. She caressed his cheek, not caring who saw. "Damn you, Mac Chance. How am I supposed to write a coherent sentence when you come at me with a statement like that?" "I don't know. I just had to say it. I'm tired of living without you. I was proud for too long, ambitious for too long, and thick-headed and a lot of other things. I've never loved any woman but you, and you know it. I'll take the blame for keeping us apart." "My," she rocked back. "You have changed." "I don't know," he repeated with a shrug. "I'm willing to try, though." With a little laugh, she leaned her head on his shoulder. "I've changed, too. Look at all this gray in my hair." "It's becoming." "Nonsense. I'm not young any longer. I'm not sure of myself the way I was when I was 20. It's a penalty of age. I'll tell you another. I get cold in bed at night. Books won't keep a body warm. I think a husband would be very desirable." "The right husband." "There's only one, Mac." Unable to hold back, she clung to his neck and cried. Peter Sledgeman walked near the auto and gave the lovers a look of hatred. "No, there's never been any other." She kissed his dry, cracked mouth. He hugged her there in the morning sunshine, ready to faint from excitement and exhaustion. But he had things to do. "I have to drag Tarbox out of whatever hole he's hiding in," Mac said, "and send him to Fresno for a doctor." "I must get busy, too," Nellie said. She found her reporter's pad and set her sights on Sheriff Chittenden. Moving away, she closed her eyes and said, "Margaret, bless you." "What did you say?" Mac called from 6 feet behind her. "Nothing, darling, nothing." 9 days later, Diego Marquez was well enough to leave the barracks. Mac drove him to Fresno to catch the Southern Pacific. As he walked with Marquez to the platform, he wondered what would become of the ex-priest. He looked grossly fat and still showed poor color, even though he'd quite recovered from the dangerous fever and pneumonia. "Goodbye, Mac. Thank you for what you did." "De nada. It was the only right thing. I wish we could be real friends again." With a weary wryness, Marquez said, "A long time ago you suggested I was a conscience, self-appointed. Can you tell me the name of any man who is friendly with his conscience?" "I'm serious, Diego." "What you propose is not possible." "It was possible once." "All greedy men despise a liberal spirit. Are you such a rare exception?" "If that's what you think about me, it makes me angry. You don't know me anymore." "I know myself. I know what I believe and preach. The church constrained me to walk a narrow road. Then I left her to walk another, steeper one, strewn with thorns and traps, and almost sure to lead to darkness. It's the familiar road of fools and martyrs, those who willingly let their bodies be crushed because they are so presumptuous as to think their ideas must prevail. We are on different sides. Different armies, same side. Marquez looked doubtful as they shook hands, and he put his foot on the step of the southbound Pullman car. For a moment his eyes lost focus and he swayed. The black porter caught Marquez quickly and steadied him until he recovered his balance. Mac shook his head. What a pair they were, he and Marquez. Two California outcasts. After a moment, Marquez said, "Thank you again. You're entirely welcome." Marquez made the sign of the cross. "God protect you." The porter helped him up the steps. It was slow going, and Marquez frequently uttered little gasps. He acted like a man beset by everything from piles to the white Christian Republican wrath of General Otis. Well, that too was California. Mac was consumed by an enormous sadness as the southbound express pulled out in a cloud of steam. That night he had a strange dream. It began with the blizzard, but soon shifted to California, to scenes of himself with Swampy, the old German refusing him water. Then Mac saw himself refusing it to Gopal Mukherjee in the yard of the ranch. Waking about 3 a.m., he thought he knew what it meant. He'd come perilously close to becoming a Walter Fairbanks, a man who claimed his gold and then denied others the right to look for theirs. In the morning, using the repaired telephone line at the ranch, he contacted Alex Muller on Greenwich Street. "Dig out the address for Jakob Steinweiss. Telegraph him and tell him I'll sell him the land." 84. At noon on the third Friday in August 1911, James Macklin Chance married the former Natalia Rochev in a parlor of the Hollywood Hotel, a justice performing the civil ceremony. William R. Hearst gave the bride away, and Johnson came down from Niles to stand up for Mac. The moment the Texan stomped across the veranda of the rambling frame hotel, two bellhops recognized him and one asked him to sign a baggage check. Such was the escalating fame of Bronco Billy, his pictures, and his stock company. There was a lively reception following, attended by a raffish crowd of journalists and some of Mac's associates. Alex and his wife, Sophia, Billy Biggerstaff, his manager in Riverside, and Mrs. Biggerstaff, Haven Ogg of the oil company, with his wife and all 12 children, Enrique Potter, a widower now. At about 7, Mac and Nellie bid the guests good evening and retired to the bedroom of the hotel's largest suite. There was none of the shyness or hurried clumsiness of lovers new to one another, rather a comfortable quality, like a reunion of long-time sweethearts. After, they talked a while of the convoluted road each had traveled to this intersection of their lives that they'd almost passed by. Nellie had a strong point to make to her new husband. "If I give up some of myself, I expect the same of you. I won't be ignored, jobbed aside, the way Carla was." "I understand." He reached out. "What time is it?" He knocked his pocket watch off the side table and crawled out of bed naked and knelt over it, squinting. 10:30. I have to go." "Now? Where?" "Downstairs. The chef promised me the kitchen as soon as the dining room closed." "Why on earth?" "Be patient. It's a surprise." He kissed her ardently, jumped into his trousers and a shirt, and left her in the dark. He didn't come back until after midnight. At Hollywood and Highland, on the corner opposite the hotel, a man watched the high cupola of the wedding suite. The night air had a stale, dusty smell, the smell of drought, relieved only a little by the faded scent of withering rose bushes. But the man, whose age and features the darkness concealed, was immune to the subtle odors. All he fixed on was the flash of electric light in the cupola, the figure moving in silhouette, then the light blinking off again. Good. They were still there. He could safely sleep till morning in some out-of-the-way corner of this proper, righteous suburban community of 3,500 souls. He wandered for several blocks until he found a nook between two alley trash boxes, next to a fence with a sign reading, "No dogs, no Jews, no actors." Trembling, Wyatt crouched down between the trash boxes. His tongue felt huge and heavy. 1,000 little insects crawled over his scalp, in his ears, under his arms, up his groin. He fumbled in the pocket of his rancid coat, a stolen coat 2 sizes too large, then nearly broke the needle, giving himself the desperately craved injection. In the morning, Mac loaded 2 wicker hampers on top of other gear in a rented surrey. Soon after, Mr. and Mrs. J. M. Chance went clipping along westward on Sunset Boulevard, a broad dirt avenue with P.E. rails in the center and telephone and telegraph wires straggling overhead. Hollywood was a drowsy little town of checkerboard lots, dull Midwestern bungalows, and the occasional interruption of a showy Cape Cod manse. Nellie clung to his arm and smiled and sang to herself. After Mac came back to bed, smelling of flour, spices, and other kitchen scents, they'd scarcely slept. She was tired, but she felt delicious. "Saddle horse," Wyatt said to the youngster on duty at NAR's Sunset Livery. He'd watched the isolated building about 20 minutes until he was sure there was but one person inside. "Here's a nice fast mare, Rosabelle. Need her 1 day or more?" "1 day." The boy reached for a saddle blanket without great haste. "Hurry up about it." When Rosabelle was saddled, the boy had second thoughts about this stranger. The man's nondescript suit bore all sorts of foul-looking stains. A shiny, weeping sore marked the corner of his mouth, and his hair was long, spiky, and dulled by dirt. Even the white streaks had a gray cast. The boy decided on his own initiative to discourage the customer by doubling the price. $6. The livery was dark and smelled of straw and manure. Wyatt kept shooting glances at the burning sunshine outside the double doors. The boy held out his hand for payment, hoping the man wouldn't have it. Definitely something wrong about him. Turned away from the youngster, Wyatt suddenly swung back with his hands clasped together, a hammer of flesh. He bashed the boy's head, staggering him, then pounded him a second and third time. The horses began to stamp and whinny and kick their stalls. Wyatt slapped a hand over the youngster's mouth and dragged him into an empty stall. Gripping the sides of the stall, he watched the double doors while he stamped the youngster's head, neck, and chest with his hobnailed shoe. He left the youngster dead, and after locking up the stables, mounted Rosabelle and trotted into Sunset Boulevard, immediately turning west and galloping ahead of a big red interurban car. It was another hot, hazy morning, and Mac soon shed his jacket. The foothills of the Santa Monicas had a sear yellow look. A sultry breeze came up, raising dust. He turned the surrey toward the foot of Coldwater Canyon. At the last farm they passed, the householder, up on a ladder repairing his windmill, shouted to them, "You going up yonder?" "Yes, sir, I own some property. We're going to hike in and camp." "Careful with your campfire. This drought's bad and everything's tinder dry." "Appreciate the warning." Mac shook the reins and drove on. At dusk, Wyatt stole into a grove a few hundred yards above the twisting Coldwater Canyon road. Dust blew over the ground. The wind was stronger, but there'd be no rain tonight. The evening sky was yellow-white, like firelit brass. Chilly and shaking, Wyatt staggered behind a tree for the last of his syringes. He dropped it when he finished, needle and barrel catching the light. Mac had unhitched the surrey and tethered the horse with a large nose bag. Now, smelling Wyatt, the horse whinnied. Wyatt sidled up to the fretful horse and began to smile and stroke and charm the animal to silence while his eyes searched the hills above. A mile or so up, on a folded edge of ridge, a smudge of red located the campsite. The hot, still air and the dust of the countryside made him feel excruciatingly dirty, and so did his 4 days' stubble of beard. He hated that soiled, gritty feel of his skin. It was the feel of poverty, failure. Well, things would improve when he finished this. That lawyer would deposit the agreed-upon sum into the separate bank account he had set up, and he could move forward again. Of course, to clear his trail, he had to dispose of Nellie along with Mac, but that didn't bother him. Not for a moment. He continued petting and whispering to the horse until it was quiet. Then he stole out of the purpling shadow of the grove and began to climb a narrow foot trail. In a clearing on the brown ridge, Mac had set up the double tent. As he started a small fire for the evening, Nellie cast an apprehensive eye at the sere hilltops. "Mac, it's a tinderbox up here. Should we really be doing that?" He cast his eye around too, but said, "I'll take extra care. Douse it thoroughly when we're ready for bed. I can do this, too." With his big clasp knife, he traced a safety trench all the way around the fire, then spent a few minutes deepening it with a stick. He next unfolded a little picnic stool, canvas between crossed legs. From one hamper, he brought 2 bottles of Sonoma Creek Zinfandel, his vineyard's best. From the other, he took his waiter's corkscrew, silver, plates, napkins, and goblets. Then he produced the delicacies. First, a pâté en croûte of veal and pork, mushrooms and brandy, the crust glazed with egg before he baked it. Next, some Hass avocados, halved, with fresh lemons to squeeze over them. His main offering was matambre, a dish he'd learned from the Argentinian woman who now cooked in Riverside. To make it, he'd butterflied flank steaks and filled them with spinach leaves, thinly sliced onion rings, carrots, peppers, olives, and hard-boiled eggs, then rolled up the steaks, tied them, poached them in red wine and broth, and baked them. He took the result from a box of ice already melted into cold water, unwrapping the protective oil skin and slicing the cold meat into round sections. There were grapes and Calgold oranges for dessert. He rocked back on his boot heels and grinned. "Your wedding supper, Mrs. C." "It looks heavenly. I'll have to hire a cook. I can't match you in the kitchen." "I confess I didn't do it all. The hotel chef helped with preparations." "No false modesty now. You have a wonderful touch." "I miss doing those big dinners. I've started to miss my polo ponies and a lot of other things I enjoyed before it all went wrong." He knelt beside her and kissed her cheek. "You'll put everything right." "I'll try." They sat on the ground with their plates and wine glasses, the little camp stool serving as their table. The darkening sky was vast and hot, the stars blurred. Far down below, lights twinkled in farmhouses and a few imposing homes. To the south, they could see the lighted oil derricks on the flat open land along Wilshire Boulevard. The tent flaps snapped and cracked in the wind. After they ate, pleasurably sipping their way through 1 bottle of the Zinfandel, Mac went to the tent for the plans he'd brought along. They studied and discussed them for a while by the fire. "The design is still very good," Nellie said finally. "I agree. It's time we built a new house on Nob Hill." The wind blew bits of parched brown grass into the fire, igniting and whirling them upward on the air currents. Mac hadn't hiked in the hills for years, and he felt renewed and refreshed. "You're smiling," Nellie said. "I'm happy. I wish Jim were still with me, but he isn't, so I'll settle for what I have." He leaned over to plant a light kiss. "Which I like very much, Mrs. Chance." She caressed his cheek, but her eyes were momentarily troubled. "Do you really think he's gone for good?" "Yes. I feel sure he's alive, but I know now that he doesn't want any part of me. Maybe I don't want to find him anymore." "Oh, Mac, no." "It's true. Maybe I can't stand to face him and hear what he thinks of me. I do know that lately I haven't kept after the Pinkertons quite so hard as I once did." "But if you think there's still any chance of finding him, you mustn't give up. You simply mustn't. Not while you can draw a breath. He's your boy." "Nellie, Nellie." He tousled her hair, his face lined by pain. "I know. Do you think I don't know? God, there's hardly an hour that I don't feel it." And she was right, absolutely right, about pressing the search till the day he died. Yet, deep within, he was apprehensive. He'd probed for the truth about Jim's feelings and found it, and he feared it. The canvas of the tent snapped again, and wind blowing over the mountain summit streamed into the fire, causing them to hitch back away from it. Scattering sparks fell among the tall weeds to one side of the clearing. Mac scanned the sky. Wind's changed direction. Santan coming. Guess we'd better think about going home in the morning. I've things to do in Riverside. Drowsily, lovingly, Nellie caressed the curve of his chin. All right, but we still have the night. She gave him a lingering kiss. Oh my, I do wonder why it took me so long to come to my senses. Both of us, Nellie. I had some pretty wrong-headed ideas about women. I had some pretty wrong-headed ideas of my own. Long ago, I should have gotten over being scornful of the way you set your sights for the top of a mountain and then got there. I really do admire you for all you've accomplished, and especially the way you've put all your success to so many good uses. He kissed her chin, smiling again. Are you trying to soften me up so I'll take you on a better honeymoon someday? This has been the best honeymoon I've ever had, and the only one I want. She kissed him. The santan blew. Higher up, in deep weeds so dry they snapped at the touch, Wyatt watched the embracing couple in the penumbra of light. The climb up the hills, well away from the foot trail, had been long and arduous, but worth it. He'd cornered them, and the shift of the wind gave him an extra benefit he hadn't anticipated. He rummaged in his pocket for his last scrap of bread, then stuffed it into his mouth. He probed the pocket again. The matchbox was safe, but he should hold off until they were sleeping soundly in the tent before he set the fire. So he hunkered down to wait. In 10 minutes he was perspiring. In 30 his palms crawled and silent screams filled his head. If he didn't get back to Los Angeles soon, didn't get a pipe of opium or a syringe of morphine, he'd die. He couldn't wait hours and hours. He pulled out the box of matches and sat there cross-legged in the parched weeds, tossing the matches up and down, listening to them rattle. The wind ripped down over the Santa Monicas, blowing harder. Mac leaned on his elbows, musing. I've made so much money in California, more than I ever dreamed of making, and I built such a wall of property and propriety around myself, I didn't understand what it had done to me till the moment that Hindustani fellow stood there with the dipper and I told him to put it down. I had a dream that told me I was doing exactly what Swampy and Fairbanks did to me. I almost shut the door on Steinweiss, too. I've got mine, you stay out so I can keep more for myself. There's a lot of that in California. There's a lot of it in human nature. With an enormous whoosh, the wind blew a cloud of sparks off the fire. They momentarily swirled in the air, then settled. Not 3 yards from where Mac and Nellie stretched out on a blanket, the knee-high grass smoked and caught fire. Mac ran over and stamped it out. That farmer was right. These hills are tender. Creeping down on them, Wyatt heard and smiled, and struck a sulfur match on his boot and touched it to the brush. Nellie saw the sudden blaze above them and scrambled to her feet. Mac, I saw someone on the hill up there. Are you sure? Yes, I saw a man. Someone started that fire. Chuckling to himself, Wyatt ran stealthily through the brush. He slipped and stumbled across the ridge and struck another match and tossed it, then ran the other way, starting a third blaze. All 3 leaped high and quickly began to spread. Wyatt bobbed up and down on his toes, tapping his palms together like a gleeful child. I saw him too, Mac yelled over the roar of wind and the crackle of fire. It leaped down the dry slope, devouring brush, growing hotter and higher every moment. Come on, Nellie, we're going down. What about the tent? Our things? The hell with things. Hurry. He caught her hand, the hand with the plain circlet of gold on the 4th finger. They started for the winding foot trail to the glade where they'd left the surrey. Above them, the fire raised a red wall with flags of smoke blowing on top. After running 20 yards down the trail, they looked back. A long finger of fire poked their tent, and then the canvas smoked, blackened, and burst into flame. Mac shielded her with his arm, the wind snapping his shirt sleeves and tossing her cap of graying hair. Stumbling, sliding, they ran on with the whole ridge starting to burn behind them. Through rents in the wall of flame, Wyatt watched. A sudden enraged confusion swept over him. He'd made a mistake by not waiting. They were escaping. "No," he said to himself, and aloud, "No!" He skidded down a slope around the left edge of the fire. It was traveling down the ridge with incredible speed, having already consumed the tent and engulfed the campsite. The santan gusted suddenly, and fire billowed at Wyatt from the right. His sleeve caught. He shrieked in a high, girlish voice, pounding his arm against his thigh until he beat the fire out. Then, careless of his footing, he stumbled and fell, bouncing, rolling, turning over and over, dry brush whipping his cheeks, small stones raking and drawing blood. He rolled into a shallow gully that braked his descent abruptly. His left leg was bent beneath him. As he started to roll over and straighten it, he knew something was wrong. Christ, the pain! He screamed, and then he felt intense heat. Twisting onto the other shoulder, he saw the fire directly above, racing down. He screamed words this time. "Mac! Mac, help me!" On the foot trail, running and jumping and at the same time steadying Nellie, Mac heard the cry. He dug in his heels, and Nellie exclaimed and crashed into him, rattling his teeth. He bit his tongue and tasted blood. He stroked her hair while he stared upward at the rampart of fire, not believing what he'd heard, yet almost certain he wasn't mistaken. "Mac! That man's hurt." "The one who set the fire?" "God help me, Nellie. I know who it is," he said, pulling away. "You can't go back up there." He ran up the trail. Mac climbed the ridge through the raging wind, choking smoke, furious heat. Wyatt lay on his side in the shallow gully, in excruciating pain. On the back of his unwashed neck, he felt the fire coming closer. His confused thoughts sorted themselves with a speed and clarity unknown to him since well before the tabernacle failed. He stretched a hand downward. "Hurry, Mac!" "Wyatt, is it you?" In his dementia, Wyatt started to weep. "I didn't want to kill you," he sobbed, "but Fairbanks promised me a lot of money." Running, climbing, pain beginning to bore into his chest from the exertion, Mac shouted the name he thought he'd heard. "Fairbanks?" "Fairbanks!" Wyatt cried, so clearly there was no possibility of misunderstanding. Mac was 50 feet below Wyatt, but the fire was scarcely 20 feet above the fallen man. The heat began to parch Mac's exposed skin, and he flung up a forearm. The hillside was bright as noon. The santan and the fire singing an evil duet, soprano and bass. "Mac, hurry! I'm hurt! I can't move!" "Hold on!" Mac shouted, now within 20 feet of him. A blast of fire leaped over the gully, almost into Mac's face. The smoke blinded him and set him coughing. "Go on." He ran at the fire with every intention of doing so, but stopped when the flames shot over his head. Through a rent in the smoke, he had a glimpse of Wyatt's trousers burning, and then his hair. A hand with spread fingers groped for the sky. Flame ran up Wyatt's sleeve. The firewall battered Mac backward, and the gap closed. Mac held Nellie in his arms a half-mile down the trail. Above, the fire was jumping to a second ridge, and very faintly, on the dark flatlands below, alarm bells pealed. "I couldn't get him," Mac said, his eyes full of angry tears. "Not without dying myself, and I wasn't willing. God, that's shameful." "How can you say that? He came up here to kill you." "He must have gone crazy, poor Wyatt. Poor Wyatt. Wyatt, the failed dreamer. California had given Mac everything. For Wyatt, everything was too much. The freedom was too much, and it had killed him. 85. The opera was Trovatore. At the first interval, Mr. and Mrs. James Macklin Chance and their guests, the SNA star Margaret Leslie and the character player H.B. Johnson, left the Chance box for the lobby. It was autumn, the season's gala opening, and everyone was in finery. The circle foyer was packed, and so was the magnificent marble stair leading down. Some crushed their way up, some crushed their way in the opposite direction. The foursome were among the latter, and Margaret excited comment and drew stares because her face was widely known. Johnson beamed. The old cowboy looked almost respectable in white tie and tails. "Do you like it?" Margaret asked as they squeezed and pushed on the stair. "Not much. I don't know Italian, and I don't know what they're carrying on about," Johnson complained. Margaret patted him soothingly. "You'll understand in the next act." "But I won't like it." She patted again. Under the great crystal chandelier, a diamond bracelet worn outside her white glove winked with starry light. Anderson had given her the bracelet when he decided the public loved her. A few steps below, Nellie and Mac came upon a familiar couple. "Governor, Mrs. Johnson," Mac said. He shook hands with Hiram Johnson while Nellie exchanged greetings with the First Lady. Hiram Johnson drew Mac to the balustrade and whispered a word or two in his ear. "Consider it done, sir." The governor and his wife then pressed on upward. Near the bottom of the stairs, Mac paled suddenly. Nellie said, "Darling, what—" and then saw a couple breaking away from the group. Walter Fairbanks III and his wife. Mac's head whirled in a red fury. He'd not seen Fairbanks since Wyatt died in the Hollywood foothills, his body consumed and never found. Mac thought Wyatt had probably been responsible for the bullet fired into his car in Riverside, too. Nellie wondered how her husband would react, given the name Wyatt had shouted just before the end. She watched Mac with a grave air, knowing that in the old days, the old California, a man like Mac meeting a man like Fairbanks would have drawn a pistol and shot him. Now, looking trim and altogether proper in his tales, Mac simply stood by the balustrade, defying the lawyer to come up. Fairbanks didn't avoid his eye. Mac had to give him that much. He held Carla's elbow to steady her on the steps. Mac tried to imagine what Fairbanks would say and how he should answer. It was an unnecessary effort. Fairbanks cut him, walking right by and waving at an acquaintance out the head of the stairs. Over her shoulder, Carla gave Mac a blurred smile of apology. Then, a step above Mac and a step behind her husband, she stumbled. Mac shot his hand out to prevent a fall, and her face came into focus. There was still something youthful and cornflower pretty about her blue eyes, but the rest was wasted, ruined by drink, age, and weight. Carla Hellman Chance Fairbanks wore Parisian clothes, an amber satin gown with a dolman wrap of black and gold brocade, a white fox fur edging the wrap. Some creature was always dying for Carla, he thought cynically. She was opulent, but fat, every pound an unhappiness. He felt sorry for her. "Thank you, Mac. Thank you so much." She pressed his hand with her glove and gave him an intense look. He thought he detected certain confusion or doubt in her eyes, but then it dissolved. A glance up the stairs showed her husband occupied with his acquaintance. "Please telephone me Monday," she whispered. "Walter will be in Sacramento arguing an appeal. There's something I want to tell you before I go away. It's important. Please call." Fairbanks was glaring down at her, and now she signaled that she was coming. Under her perfume, Mac smelled whiskey. She tottered up the stairs. With Nellie's permission, he telephoned Carla as requested. She arranged to meet him at 2 o'clock at virtually the same place he'd confronted Abe Roof. Today the weather was different. Marin's gentle hills were sharply defined in the crystalline sunlight, and the sparkling Golden Gate teemed with inbound and outbound marine traffic. Mac paced up and down, consulting his watch. Carla was late. For a moment, he wondered if Fairbanks had found out about the meeting. Possible, but not likely, he decided. Carla's husband was busy with many other things these days, domestic matters the least of them. Only a week ago, over highballs at the Olympic Club, Rhett Haverstick had told him a story about the lawyer. "I have a colleague who's wild for Charles Dickens. He comes up with this wonderful Dickensian name for Walter and every other attorney in the city. At least the ones who despise Walter, and that's a majority, is using the name behind his back. They call him Mr. Old Food." "Mr. what?" Haverstick repeated and spelled it. "I don't understand." "Simple enough," Haverstick said. "Walter has a practice, all right. Real estate contracts, society divorces. Hardly sufficient to keep him in his customary style, but of course that doesn't matter with the income from all his Fairbanks trust stock. However, there is a man's money, and then there is his self-respect. The only legal work that enables Fairbanks to call himself a real attorney, keep a staff of clerks and typewriters, is the work from the people who cast him off, like the SP Legal Department. They throw him crusts and bones. Hence Mr. Old Food, Esquire." Haverstick chuckled. "If he ever heard the name, it would kill him." So Mac had won a victory of sorts, but it gave him no satisfaction. Carla's chauffeured auto arrived at 2:20. She stumbled toward him along the esplanade. "I can't stay but a moment, my dear. I'm leaving in the morning." "Yes, I recall you made some reference to that. Another trip?" "Not one I care to take. Walter's sending me away, all the way to New York, Saratoga Springs, a health spa. Actually, it's a sanitarium for drunkards." "God, Carla." He shook his head. "Oh, perhaps it'll do me good," she said with an airy, empty laugh. "We're not here to discuss my woes. We haven't for years, have we?" Thinking of her husband, he said impulsively, "Will you answer one question for me?" "I'll try, sweet." "What the hell has Walter wanted all these years? From me, I mean. Just my life? My complete, total capitulation?" "You mean you have no idea?" "Would I ask if I did?" "To be like you." "Like you? He's wanted to be like you from that first day Papa refused you a drink and you stood up to him. You're what Californians used to be, and Walter never was." She touched his face with an elegant glove. "Oh, Mac, so much trouble between us. So much terrible trouble. I hated you. A lot of times I wanted to hurt you, but I was never bored. Never with you. Papa was wrong about that. You're the only man who never bored me for a single minute. I was afraid of you most of the time. I was afraid you'd see all of my bad side, and then start thinking about it. I was afraid, and frightened people are angry people. That's why I drank so much around you. I knew you hated it. And then I walked out on you and the baby when I was drunk and crazy and, well, you know. Papa was absolutely right about one thing. You are the best man I ever loved. If you want to know the truth, the only one." Mac turned red. Bright tracks of tears showed on her pouchy cheeks. "I want to tell you something in absolute confidence," she went on. "Something you deserve to know. You mustn't ask how I come by the information. Just take me at my word when I say it's true. Promise?" "All right, yes." A long beat of silence. "Our son is alive. Walter saw him in Pasadena, and I saw him in Redlands this spring. He's taken another name. He wanted no part of Walter. He said you were his father." Mac wondered if he'd been hurled back to the moment when the great quake rocked the earth. He felt so. "Now I hope you believe I love you." Slowly, tenderly, Carla leaned forward and gave his cheek a wet, mussy kiss. She left lip rouge like a blood stain. Looking his face up and down, she caressed it once, Then, with the stiff, stately elegance sometimes achieved by the inebriated, she walked down the esplanade. A floating cloud covered her in shadow. 86. The lame boy? Jim David? The manager of the Redlands Citrus Cooperative pointed into the sunshine. Should find him right out there somewheres. Mac turned his Homburg around and around in his nervous, sweating hands. Jim David? Hello. Do you know who I am? His face said he did. I guess you also know that I'm not your father, but I've come here to say that I want to be if you'll have me. On the ladder, Jim David stared at the well-dressed, white-haired man, so out of place in the sunny orange grove. Coda, El Dorado, 1921. The painted sign atop the huge hangar announced its owner, Calross Aviation, Long Beach, Long Island City, London, Paris. The hangar doors were open, and a trim racing biplane stood on the sunlit tarmac, its colors gold and black. Mac walked out of the hangar in a leather coat, helmet, goggles, and a too flamboyant white scarf. He was portly now, his face heavily lined. Nellie followed, along with Jim, limping as always, but tall and smart in his business suit. He was 23 years old, this 28th day of September, and while he couldn't whirl a girl on the dance floor, he was one of the most sought-after bachelors in Southern California. Johnson emerged from the hangar, pushing Jocker in a bright chrome wheelchair. Mac's chauffeur had fetched the old man from a home for the elderly, where he was maintained in good style at Mac's expense. Jocker was snowy-haired. His hands rested on the blue tartan coverlet wrapped around his legs. They were grotesquely misshapen, but his eyes were sharp and alert, and his smile was genuine. He understood the significance of the occasion. Proudly, Mac indicated the Calross Special standing on the chocks. There she is, Jim, with the new Swiss racing engine that's going to help us whip the Curtiss R1. Jim smiled but said nothing. He wasn't sure Mac had finished speaking. People were obliged to listen attentively to J.M. Chance. He was that kind of man. Nellie watched her husband with loving tolerance. Nearly as gray as Mac now, she wore a two-piece country suit of tweed, complemented by a white ascot and a black silk sailor, all bought in Paris on Mac's last business trip. Nellie hadn't published a novel since Huntworthy's Millions. She hadn't abandoned writing. She did it regularly, 3 or 4 mornings a week, but had moved to nonfiction. She had nearly finished a work closely related to her early career, a candid memoir of her days on the Examiner. She called it We Made the News. It was doubtful that Mr. Hearst would care for it. We're going to race her, Mac said. The Pulitzer Trophy this fall. Hell, I may even put floats on her and send her to Europe for the Schneider Cup. She's yours. Sir? I believe I misunderstood. No, you didn't. The special is yours. Happy birthday, my boy. Mac hugged him. Don't look so startled. Why shouldn't I give my son a plane if I want? You're an excellent pilot, and you're doing a first-class job managing the finances of Calross and all the other companies. Thank you, Pa. It's a labor of love. You know that. Have you flown her? Not this version. The privilege of the first flight belongs to the owner, you. With a teasing smile, Jim said, I know it isn't politic to disagree with the founder of the firm, but the first flight has to be yours, with my compliments. No, I couldn't. Pa, I insist. If it wasn't for you, the special would be just another dream on a designer's drawing board. Please, take her up. Well, Mac muttered, abashed and touched. Well, all right. Thank you, son. He started fitting on his leather flying gloves tucked into the belt of his coat. Jim and his stepmother exchanged amused glances. Ah, wait, I almost forgot, Mac said abruptly. He reached into the pocket of his leather coat for something flat wrapped in butcher paper. Small, but important. With my love. Jim unwrapped the butcher paper and then looked wonderingly at his father. "Your book?" "That's right. T. Fowler Haynes, the original. I thought it was time I passed it on. That book taught me a lot, my boy. It taught me about the real treasure of California. It isn't oil or oranges or real estate, or even the gold people are still panning for up in the Motherlode country. It isn't the sunshine or the Sierras that make this state so special. It's hope. That's the real gold of California, Jim. Hope. Not a human being on God's earth who doesn't need hope." He squeezed his son's shoulder. "I want you to have the book. I wish I could get rid of that damn blizzard dream as easily." Jim flung his arms around his father. Jocker chortled. A moment later, Nellie took Mac's arm. "I'll walk out to the plane with you." Surprised, he said, "Why, certainly, come along." Jim stayed with Johnson and Jocker, thumbing the pages of The Emigrant's Guide to California and its gold fields. As they walked, Nellie said, "I don't know whether this is the appropriate time." "Time for what? You sound positively ominous." "Time to tell you a secret I've harbored for years. Sometimes I've quite forgotten it. The book reminded me. I didn't know you were going to give it to him." "What is this, Nell? What secret are you talking about? You're too old to be pregnant." She laughed. "The book, T. Fowler Haynes." "Yes, what about it?" Glancing back at their son, she stepped near the plane. She kissed his cheek and by means of that contrived to whisper, "It's a fake." "I beg your pardon?" "Mac, don't be angry. You've always respected the truth. This is the truth. T. Fowler Haynes never traveled west of his birthplace on the Passaic River in New Jersey. Remember years ago I said I intended to look him up? I did. I discovered a whole literature of scholarship about Gold Rush guidebooks, chiefly centered on exposing the fakery of most of them. In '49, publishers were no different than they are today. They seized on every trend, and the Gold Rush was the biggest event of its time. Eastern publishers rushed to hire any available hack, and Haynes was one, a journalist for the penny papers. He died at 36 of a liver ailment, 1 year after he wrote his guide in a loft near Printing House Square. He was no worse than a lot of others. Why didn't you tell me before? Many a time when we fought, I came close. But you held back. Some knives are just too sharp to be used. Well, Mac rested a hand on the rim of the cockpit of the Cal Ross Special and studied the sky with a vaguely wounded air. "Well," he said again, "Haynes may have been a fraud, but he was right about California. Dead right." His mouth set. "I refuse to tell Jim." She touched him affectionately. "That was my idea, too." The mechanic ran out of the hangar and Mac lowered himself in the cockpit. A moment later, the hornet snarl of the water-cooled aluminum block Hisso engine deafened the observers. Mac showed a thumbs up above the cockpit. The mechanic jerked the chocks. Then the Cal Ross Special rushed down the sunlit runway. Suddenly airborne, the racing plane rose through the splendor of the morning, moth-like against the panorama of the California mountains, the California sky. Holding her black sailor hat, Nellie murmured, "I've seen that same look on his face as long as I've known him." "So've I," Johnson said. "He's going prospecting." "He'll never stop," Jim said. He put an arm around his stepmother's waist and his other hand on Jocker's shoulder, and they watched the Cal Ross Special shrink to a dot above the blue Pacific, flying due west. The real El Dorado is still further on. Peck's 1837 New Guide to the West. Afterward. It is hard to believe in this fair young land, because there has always been something about it that has incited hyperbole, that is made for exaggeration. For there is a golden haze over the land, the dust of gold is in the air, and the atmosphere is magical and mirrors many tricks, deceptions, and wondrous visions. Carey McWilliams. California, the Great Exception. California is quintessentially American, yet it is also a universal symbol, exerting a universal appeal with its visions of sunshine and surf, palm trees and movie glamour, indolence and escape and renewal. California is the world's paradigm of hope and opportunity. Why this is so and how it came to be about are subjects I have long wanted to explore in a novel, together with some of the flavorful and exciting history of the state as it changed from the old frontier to a modern society. On my shelves of California reference works, I can immediately locate the first one I bought, A General History of the State by Warren Beck and David Williams. I bought it in a chain bookstore a couple of blocks from the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, where I was staying on a book promotion tour. On the flyleaf, I inked the year, 1979. I wanted to write about California before I finished the Kent Family Chronicles or undertook the North and South trilogy. A decade later, California Gold is the realization of that dream. Some notes for the curious. The late John Dickson Carr wrote a number of vivid and entertaining mystery novels with historical settings. At the end of each one, Carr always added a section to footnote certain events in the story or explain any small liberties taken with the factual record. These he called Notes for the Curious. I have borrowed his apt phrase for the same purpose. Before each note, I give the section and chapter most appropriate. Part 1, Chapter 5 and following. My portrayal of the railroad, its methods and influence, is consistent with the attitude of a great majority of Californians at the time. They feared and loathed the octopus. In the early decades of the 20th century, this highly negative slant was almost universal among scholarly and popular historians. Today, however, the early traditional view is considered one-sided and unfair, and is being challenged by scholars. The revisionist view is that the railroad empire created by the Big Four not only united the nation, but was a major force in the growth of California. In short, the SP was not the absolutely malign power it was perceived to be in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I am aware of at least one scholar who is working on a new, more balanced history of the SP, and there may be others. Part 1, Chapter 5. Pope Leo XIII published the encyclical Rerum Novarum on the condition of labor in May 1891, later than indicated in the story. The remarkable letter is a comprehensive analysis of the world labor problem and a far-seeing humane plan to alleviate it. Part 2, Chapter 13 and following. Bow Key's Nickel Ferry is based on John L. Davies' larger and later effort to make a success of such a service. He had a thriving business for a short time, but ultimately the competitive muscle of the SP was just too strong, and Davies' ferry line shut down. Part 3, Chapter 16. Health claims in Wyatt's literature are taken from promotional literature of the day. Truth in advertising did not exist. Part 3, Chapter 21. The Los Angeles typographers' strike actually took place in 1890. In 1888, however, Harrison Gray Otis was already campaigning against the open shop. Part 4, Chapter 27. Johnson's oil burner was actually invented by Lyman Stewart of Hardison & Stewart, the forerunner of Union Oil, now Unocal. The present-day corporation cannot turn up a detailed description or picture of the burner. If there are any oil historians out there who can, I would be grateful to know. This remains one of a few loose ends of historical research that I could not tie up to my satisfaction. Part 4, Chapter 31. Some details of the railway accident are taken from the January 1883 wreck of the Overland Express at Tehachapi Summit. It was a famous tragedy of the period. 15 people died. Part 5, Chapter 34 and following. Chinese laborers were driven from the orange groves when the Panic of '93 sent thousands of unemployed whites onto the roads of California seeking work. There is a great dark vein of bigotry running through California history. Driving around Riverside on March 15, 1988, I saw the following spray-painted on a large water tank. All nips must die. California natives rule. Part 5, Chapter 41. The lovely phrase, "Spellbound in Darkness," is the title of a work on silent pictures by the late George Pratt, a distinguished film historian. Part 6, Chapter 44. An immigrant from Britain, W.K.L. Dickson, invented the kinetograph at the Edison Laboratory in 1888. Later, Edison lent his name to the Vitascope projection system of Thomas and J. Hunter Arendt of East Orange, New Jersey, because it was superior to the projection system he was developing. As stated in Part 9, Edison was not always enthusiastic about moving pictures, but he was a keen promoter and took more credit for creating the movies than he deserves. Part 6, Chapter 49. I have advanced the date of Barney Oldfield's driving exhibition in Riverside by some months. The speed record was actually set in December 1902, and it was broken 6 months later, again by Oldfield. Part 7, Chapter 56. Abe Roof drove through San Francisco with $50,000 in shirt boxes 1 month after the earthquake, not before. Part 7, Chapter 56 and following. I arbitrarily advanced the commercial introduction of the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost by 1 year because I wanted Mac to drive one of these great cars. Part 7, Chapter 61. Despite the devastation and tragedy, there are occasional flashes of humor in the aftermath of the 1906 earthquake. While the story may be apocryphal, Caruso is said to have been awakened when part of the ceiling of his room in the Palace Hotel fell on him. He reportedly dashed into the street in his nightshirt, clutching a towel and an autographed photo of President Roosevelt, exclaiming, "Hell of a place! Give me Vesuvius!" From the same fount of legends comes the story of a young actor on tour, John Barrymore, who, in characteristic fashion, was too busy to get up when the commotion started. He was in bed at the St. Francis with someone else's fiancée. Part 8, Chapter 62. Like Jim Chance, and at roughly the same age, Jack London was a hobo on the road. Later in life, in very euphemistic and unrevealing language, he wrote about his experience with jockers, older tramps who kept young road boys as slaveys. The inference is that while many of the men used their young companions sexually, London escaped this fate. Part 8, Chapter 62. Nellie's Outdoor Cafe and the slogan on it, deriding Oakland, are taken from a post-quake photo showing those very things. Jokes about Oakland were common even then. Part 8, Chapter 66. On November 13, 1908, the rejected juror Morris Haas shot Francis J. Haney as described. Of course, he did not shoot any fictional characters. Part 9, Chapter 73. Young Charlie Chaplin filmed 4 short comedies at the S&A studio out in Niles. However, he found the facilities too primitive and, with Anderson's consent, moved on to Los Angeles. Part 9, Chapter 76. The bombing of the Los Angeles Times ultimately dealt a severe blow to organized labor. In April 1911, after a sensational nationwide manhunt, Detective William J. Burns, of the San Francisco graft investigation, arrested one Orty McManigal, characterized as a professional dynamiter. McManigal in turn implicated John McNamara, secretary of the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers, and his brother Jim. Labor leaders staged parades and gave speeches protesting a frame-up, and Clarence Darrow was retained to defend the trio. Then McManigal struck a deal to become a state's witness. In the face of conclusive testimony, the McNamaras stunned their fellow trade unionists by confessing that they had indeed planned the crime. Darrow counseled them to plead guilty to avoid execution, which they did. The muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens, a Californian from Sacramento, helped arrange the plea bargain. General Otis was understandably the hardest to persuade. Part 10, Chapter 81. The Committee of Conscientious Citizens did exist for a short time in rural, largely Protestant Hollywood. The committee circulated petitions urging that movie actors be kept out of the community at all costs. Part 10, Chapter 82 and following. Indian migrant workers began coming down from Canada in the first decade of this century, bringing to the fields a high level of agricultural skill, like the Japanese and Chinese before them. The landmark book on this subject, Factories in the Field by Carey McWilliams, 1939, estimates that by 1915, the peak year, there were 10,000 Indians at work in the state. Two of them wrote fascinating personal memoirs of their experiences. Coda. The Emigrant's Guide by T. Fowler Haynes is an invention of the author, but is based on many other Gold Rush guidebooks compiled by Eastern journalists who never set foot in the West. Among the most famous are those of Joseph Ware, a bestseller, Henry Simpson, and J. Tyrwhitt Brooks, real name Visitelli. Finally, here are a few brief notes on people and stories touched on in the novel. William Randolph Hearst lived until 1951. The publishing empire he founded, of course, exists to this day. Hearst's long and flamboyant career included attempts to be elected mayor of New York and governor of the state, and heavy-handed efforts to influence America's public policy. He was notably successful at whipping up fervor for the Spanish-American War. Hearst had a mistress for many years, the former Ziegfeld Follies girl Marion Davies, whose film career he promoted and financed. For the two of them, he constructed his fabulous coastal retreat in Big Sur, San Simeon, a tourist landmark. Late in his life, he used the full power of his empire to condemn and try to suppress Orson Welles' classic Citizen Kane, whose central character is clearly Hearst. James J. Corbett lived until 1933 and earned money on the stage in a play specially written for him. According to the record, he was a creditable actor. Jack London died young, at age 40 in 1916. He was world famous, but had been broken physically by alcohol and diseases contracted in his travels. John Muir's remarkable life ended in 1914. To the last, he crusaded against damming the Hetch Hetchy Valley, but it was a losing fight, and the struggle weakened and saddened him. President Wilson and his Secretary of the Interior eventually cleared the way for the project, and the dam was completed in 1923. It's difficult to know whether the 1988 Reagan administration proposal to destroy the dam, drain the valley, and create a second tourist destination like Yosemite was a serious idea or just more bureaucratic maundering. Regarding Muir, the great naturalist and conservationist, James D. Hart closes the Muir entry in A Companion to California with these words: "More sites in California have been named for him than for any other person." Dr. Hart's volume is available and indispensable to any serious student of California history. In 1914, Ambrose Bitter Bierce went to Mexico on a journalistic expedition in search of the gorilla Pancho Villa. He disappeared and is presumed to have been killed, though no one knows the circumstances. As noted above, Lyman Stewart's Little Oil Company was the forerunner of one of the world's largest, Union Oil. Ed Dohany's Streetwell in Los Angeles was the foundation of a dynasty of California oil and money. Dohany was implicated in the Teapot Dome scandal during the administration of Warren Harding. Abraham Roof was paroled from prison in August 1915 and received a pardon in 1920. He dealt in real estate until the end of his life in 1936 and died bankrupt. History has a way of turning bandits into benefactors. Henry Ed Huntington, one of the heirs of the rapacious Big Four, was a passionate book collector whose agents sought out and bought whole libraries around the world. He created the Henry E. Huntington Library and Art Gallery in San Marino, one of the great historical repositories of this or any other continent. Some of the important research material used in this novel came from the Huntington. This concludes California Gold by John Jakes, narrated by Sean Compton. Copyright 1989 by John Jakes. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with John Jakes, care of Ramker LLC, and was produced in the year 2020 by Tantor Media Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit Tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.